An inferno consumed the bodies. The archives were hermetically sealed. Names once revered were systematically expunged from history. Yet, amidst this calculated erasure, an extraordinary discovery was made. A singular letter. This wasn't just any document. It was a forbidden revelation, never intended for public scrutiny, nor for the gaze of any living soul. Concealed beneath layers of dust, folded with an almost desperate secrecy, and bearing the authentic signature of a pontiff who vehemently denied its existence, this artifact emerged. Its mere presence fundamentally rewrites centuries of accepted truth. For ages, we have been led to believe the Knights Templar were unequivocally guilty, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and egregious crimes against both God and crown. But what if this narrative is a meticulously crafted falsehood? What if these knights were truly innocent, and the very institution that condemned them possessed undeniable proof of their exoneration? Allow your senses to calm, embrace the encroaching shadows. What unfolds is not a chronicle of martial prowess and valiant deeds, but a profound exploration of ink and deliberate silence, a journey into the strange, quiet corners where truth defiantly strives to outlive its persecutors. Our investigation commences not with the clash of steel and consuming fire, but with delicate parchment, and with a whisper the Church, despite its immense power, could not entirely suppress. Imagine yourself traversing a corridor steeped in the scent of aged time. It is devoid of drama. No echoing footsteps resonate, no torches flicker erratically. There is only the steady, profound hush of ancient stone and countless pages, as if the very walls have chosen to communicate in a language of silence. The air is cool, imbued with a faint, musty aroma, subtly flavored by antique candle wax and the glue of ancient bindings. You stand deep within the Vatican's clandestine repositories, though they are now officially known as the Apostolic Archive. This strategic rebranding, it must be noted, serves a purpose. It endeavors to transform an enigmatic mystery into a mere filing cabinet. Yet, the profound narratives, the hidden truths, patiently await discovery. Somewhere beneath these majestic vaulted ceilings and securely locked drawers lies a single, pivotal letter, folded and faded, once sealed with wax now cracked and brittle. It resurfaced only recently, after centuries of either inadvertent misfiling or, more chillingly, intentional concealment. The precise truth remains elusive. What undeniably matters is its message. This extraordinary document, known as the Chinon Parchment, bears the authentic papal seal of Clement V, the very pontiff who presided over the complete dismantling of the Knights Templar. Within its venerable lines, he quietly, privately, absolves them. He meticulously records that their alleged sins, the so-called heresies, the accusations that justified widespread torture, and the searing flames of execution, were, in his judgment, grossly exaggerated, perhaps even entirely fabricated. He extends his forgiveness. Yet, this profound absolution was never publicly declared. The brutal burnings tragically continued. The trials relentlessly proceeded. And this crucial letter simply vanished, until now. You find yourself pausing, compelled not solely by the letter itself, but by its monumental implications. This is not merely about a single piece of paper. It is about its earth-shattering significance. If the Church possessed prior knowledge of the Templars' innocence, why did it permit the horrific executions? Why was the truth so brutally suppressed? And why, after centuries of enforced silence, does that silence now begin to shatter? Reflect deeply on this question. Allow it to permeate your thoughts like the subtle tendrils of incense, settling into the recesses of your mind, much like dust, clings persistently to forgotten shelves and untold stories. For the saga of the Templars is far from concluded. It transcends a mere tale of valiant warriors and grand crusades. It is a profound narrative of meticulously written, painstakingly stored, deliberately hidden, and sometimes ruthlessly burned secrets. And somewhere within the forgotten lines, something endures, a lingering shadow, an undeniable voice, a truth far too inconvenient to be forgotten, too perilous to be spoken, and yet too stubborn to ever truly die. To ensure you never overlook a truth history has attempted to bury, consider joining our exploration by subscribing. Breathe. The ancient fires may be long extinguished, yet their ashes continue to whisper. One might not anticipate much from such ancient ash. It appears as light as snow, seemingly harmless. However, it clings with an insidious softness, an insistent presence, utterly impossible to completely sweep away. As your fingers trace the edge of a crumbling manuscript within a medieval archive, the centuries respond with a faint smear of soot. This is not from the present day, nor even from this century. This ash predates memory itself, preceding wars, and in certain instances, it represents all that endures. In the years immediately following the widespread arrests of the Knights Templar in 1307, a silent, pervasive conflagration commenced. This was not the roaring fire of heat and screams, but a more insidious kind, one that meticulously worked its way through drawers and shelves, subtly beginning with a candle placed just a little too close to a vital scroll. It manifested as an unexplainable smudge on a crucial corner, a sudden, inexplicable dampness in a parchment storage room after an otherwise unremarkable storm. And in more than one monastic institution, complete losses occurred. Entire scriptoriums inexplicably vanished, consumed by flame or water, leaving behind only ghostly outlines where priceless books had once stood. Officially, these incidents were attributed to misfortune, faulty storage, rodent infestations, pervasive mildew, or simple human carelessness. Yet, as time progressed, undeniable patterns emerged. Fires invariably seemed to target the right rooms, consistently sparing those repositories overflowing with secular songs or meticulously compiled genealogies. Inquisitors' letters, surprisingly, remained intact. Psalms, too, were untouched. However, records pertaining to the Templar trials, entire transcripts, were repeatedly found singed, waterlogged, or, most suspiciously, altogether vanished. You are not the first to discern this disturbing trend. Within the archives of Montreuil-Bellay, a lesser French town, notes dating to the 1320s describe pervasive damp rot that conveniently obliterated a chest of legal documents. Curiously, only those documents specifically pertaining to the trial of a local Templar commander suffered this fate. In Avignon, years later, a meticulous cataloging monk appended a hesitant footnote to a missing volume, possibly lost to the northern fire. Yet, the church in question was constructed entirely of stone, and the alleged fire left no discernible trace on its enduring walls. More recently, in 1944, during the tumultuous period of World War II, a British bomb inadvertently destroyed a section of the Vienna Stadtarchiv. Among the ashes were rare 14th century transcriptions of the Templar interrogations, sent to Austria for safekeeping by the Habsburgs. Astonishingly, the adjacent building, which housed municipal tax records, remained entirely unscathed. Even fire, it appears, can be selectively directed. Therefore, one must gravely question, were these mere coincidences or something far more deliberate? Is it truly plausible that Templar records were consistently less valued, more negligently stored, or was there a concerted effort to ensure specific pages would not endure the test of history intact? The indelible scent of ancient fire persists. Even after centuries, the aroma lingers within the bindings. One can almost detect it when lifting a charred corner, when the air subtly shifts and carries something profoundly ancient into your very lungs. Archivists meticulously don gloves, not due to any imagined curse upon the documents, but because the natural oils from human skin could potentially mar the final, desperate words ever penned by a condemned man. And some of those words, if they still existed in their entirety, might well narrate an entirely different, unsettling story. One of the scarce intact records from the early trial years makes a singular reference to a document known as the Red Codex. It is mentioned only once, briefly, by an inquisitor in Toulouse. The codex in the red binding, which contained the account of the prior's confession under duress, was dispatched to the papal legate. No such codex has ever been located. No red bindings from that era remain. Yet, archivists continue to whisper about it, pondering its reality and the orchestrator of its disappearance. Naturally, the counter-argument persists. Preservation is inherently a messy endeavor. Fires are inevitable. Mold is patient and insidious. Rats are indiscriminately voracious. However, the profound silence surrounding these losses is simply too consistent to be dismissed. When comparing diocesan and monastic libraries across Europe, those that once possessed Templar trial records versus those that did not, The losses conspicuously skew toward those repositories that once held damning contradictions. There is also the curious affair of San Cataldo in Sicily. In the mid-1800s, a restoration project in its crypts unveiled a sealed chest concealed behind a false panel. Inside lay several rolls of parchment, many water-damaged, yet one remained almost perfectly preserved. It contained an inventory of Templar holdings in Palermo and a chilling mention of a letter from Clement to the local bishop, explicitly instructing him to observe mercy. That letter, predictably, is now gone, stolen or lost during the fascist era, depending on which curator one consults. One cannot help but recall the Chinon parchment once more. That exceptionally rare letter of absolution, personally signed by Pope Clement V himself, survived solely due to its misfiling within a bundle discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001. Even then, its eventual release was remarkably quiet, almost reluctant. No celebratory press release, no grand reevaluation of the Templar legacy, merely another forgotten piece of paper, another discernible crack in the meticulously constructed edifice of history. Perhaps this is the true purpose of the ash, not utter destruction, but calculated delay. Delay the revelation of the story long enough, and fewer people will care when the truth, in its own time, finally rises through the pervasive soot. You cannot help but observe the frequent mention of fire in these records, yet the striking rarity with which their origins are explained. One must read between the lines. One scribe attributes a fire to a lightning strike on a perfectly clear day. Another speaks of unseasonable dampness in a stone room without windows. The very air becomes thick with implication, and a disturbing pattern begins to inscribe itself. There is a haunting, almost poetic quality to the death of archives. Quiet, sometimes smokeless. One moment they exist, and the next they are mere fragments, husks, whispers of what once was. And if a sufficient number of those whispers are meticulously erased, then history itself begins to forget. But not entirely. For every fire, a survivor endures. A clandestine copy, a marginal note, a half-burned scroll clandestinely tucked under a robe and spirited away. Evidence does not vanish instantaneously. It fades. And in that very fading, something profoundly persistent lingers. You recall the Montreuil Bellay fire once more, and how the surviving records were bound in a different, more resilient material, oiled leather, not fragile cloth, and how only the Templar files had been bound in cloth. This crucial detail, conspicuously absent from the official report, is nonetheless scribbled in the corner of a cataloger's diary from 1923. Curious choice of bindings, almost as if someone wanted them to burn. You lean back, allowing the chilling thought to settle, mixing with the phantom scent of smoke that isn't quite there. For truth, much like fire, leaves an indelible mark, even when the page itself is consumed. And in the adjacent room, sealed within an envelope bearing the papal insignia, another such mark patiently awaits discovery. The bells of Avignon toll with a slow, almost meditative rhythm. Imagine them resonating through the cool, ethereal fog of a spring morning in 13 or 12, their sound echoing off the still unfinished, yet already consequence-laden, walls of the papal palace. Behind one of its lofty windows, a figure cloaked in white sits silently at a writing table. His face is pale, drawn, perhaps more weary than truly devout. This is Pope Clement V, and in this solemn moment, he is not engaged in prayer. He is reading, or rather wrestling, with the monumental decision of whether to continue reading. The document before him is by no means the first of its kind. Reports from inquisitors across France, England, Aragon, and beyond have deluged him, some brutally extracted from tortured lips, others meticulously constructed confessions designed to appease their interrogators. Most unequivocally accuse the Knights Templar of heresy, kissing demons, desecrating the cross, venerating a bearded head with gemstone eyes, the typical medieval fabrications, merely polished for royal consumption. However, Clement now confronts something entirely different, something truly unexpected. This new report is markedly calmer, more factual. It is a precise transcript of Templar testimonies, taken not by zealous royal officers, but by the Pope's own trusted envoys. And its tone is strikingly devoid of sensationalism, almost dull. No mention of infernal demons, no clandestine rituals, only weary men meticulously explaining their oaths, to obey, to fight, and to vigilantly protect pilgrims. The most damning admission any of them offer is that they occasionally failed to comprehend the Latin prayers they were diligently taught to recite. You visualize Clement gently setting down the parchment, his fingers lightly tapping its edge. He is not a man inclined towards impetuous decisions. Indeed, he was never intended to become pope, merely a compromised candidate during a fractious conclave, chosen more for his diplomatic skills than any perceived divine charisma. He possessed no appetite for war or bloodshed, and certainly not for the horrific burning of hundreds of valiant knights. Yet immense pressure mounted. Not the pressure conveyed through fervent sermons, but through relentless letters bearing the unambiguous seals of royalty, most notably the seal of Philip IV of France. Philip, who owed staggering debts to the Templars. Philip, who had already initiated their mass arrest before even consulting Rome. Philip, who insisted, with escalating ferocity, that the Pope must act decisively or risk being branded complicit in their alleged sins. It is precisely here that the ominous papal silence truly begins. For months, Clement's correspondence becomes colder, more terse. He ceases to publicly champion the Templars. He suspends efforts to reassign their vast lands. He deliberately postpones his final verdict. Historians have long debated the underlying reasons. Some contend Clement was simply overwhelmed by the relentless political onslaught. Others argue he was genuinely uncertain, torn agonizingly between stark political realities and his profound spiritual obligations. And then there are those who suspect something far darker transpired, that Clement was presented with irrefutable proof, whether authentic or meticulously forged, that irrevocably convinced him the Templars genuinely posed a threat. However, no such corroborating evidence exists within the historical records. What remains, instead, is a strange, unsettling vacuum of decision-making. After convening the Council of Vienne in 1311, intended in part to definitively resolve the Templar issue, Clement delays the crucial vote, then postpones it again and yet again. At one juncture, he even proposes forming a new crusade, and merging the Templars with another order, a desperate compromise, a potential escape route. That idea, however, fails to survive the week. What proves profoundly notable, however, is a perceptible shift in the tone of his closest advisors. Memos begin to circulate, ominously warning that any perceived inaction would serve to severely weaken papal authority, and that discord with the formidable French throne must be avoided at all costs. The genuine threat, it becomes evident, was not theological, it was overwhelmingly political. If Clement were to unequivocally exonerate the Templars, he risked irrevocably severing the vital alliance with France, then the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe. And then there is the matter of Clement's health. Throughout 1312, his physical condition begins to precipitously deteriorate. Contemporary accounts describe debilitating stomach pains, recurrent seizures, and profound fatigue. Some whispered darkly of poison, though that may simply reflect the characteristic medieval penchant for scandal. Regardless, his mind was far from at ease, and still no definitive verdict. Until suddenly, and with chilling quietude, a verdict was rendered. In March 1312, entirely without ceremony, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in excelso. It conspicuously failed to declare the Templars guilty. It conspicuously avoided any mention of heresy. Instead, it simply dissolved the order by apostolic ordinance, citing the scandal surrounding them as sufficient reason. No formal trial, no judicial judgment, merely silence punctuated by a signature and a date. The Church, he declared, would undertake no further action. Yet, that was not entirely true. You undoubtedly recall the Chinon parchment, that extraordinary letter from Clement himself absolving the Templar leadership. It was penned months earlier in absolute secrecy. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged until its fortuitous discovery nearly 700 years later. If Clement had genuinely believed in their guilt, why would he ever sign such a letter? And if he genuinely believed in their innocence, why not courageously publish it? That profound contradiction lies at the very heart of this revelation. Clement's silence was not born of ignorance, it was a chilling calculation. He possessed critical knowledge, and he deliberately chose not to speak. The ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Within weeks of Vox in excelso, Templar property began its systematic transfer to the Hospitallers, though some portions were quietly seized by avaricious local lords or inexplicably lost in transition. The knights themselves, at least those fortunate enough to still be alive, were scattered, imprisoned, rendered penniless, unwanted. And Clement? He died 2 years later in his bed. No final, dramatic revelations, no last-minute confessions, just silence. The same pervasive silence that had begun when he first read that simple, unadorned report. The one devoid of demons or idols, containing only the pleas of frightened men who staunchly insisted on their loyalty, who truly believed the church would give them a fair hearing. Sometimes the absence of a verdict carries more damning weight than a formal sentence. A guilty verdict, however flawed, can eventually be overturned. A public trial, despite its imperfections, invites crucial scrutiny. But silence? Silence buries. It permits the world to advance, uncorrected, unchallenged. And yet, the letter, the crucial letter, endured, buried, hidden, patiently awaiting its discoverer. You inhale slowly. The room remains still. The only sound is the soft rustle of turning pages, the gentle thud of a thought settling somewhere deep within. Clement's silence may have reverberated for centuries, but even the most persistent echoes ultimately encounter a wall. In the town of Chinon, an ancient fortress still stands. Beneath its imposing towers, somewhere within a forgotten drawer, the absolution of the Templars once lay dormant. And for a fleeting moment, history held its breath. It is truly remarkable how truth, at times, opts for the most unassuming sanctuaries. Chinon is not a town given to grand pronouncements. It nestles quietly along the Vienne River, its houses clustered intimately, as if still harboring an ancient fear. The castle looms majestically above, part ruin, part enduring monument, part meticulously curated museum. Yet, beneath its weathered stones, smoothed by the passage of countless pilgrims, prisoners, and kings, something far more fragile once awaited discovery. A parchment, unassuming in size, small in stature, and utterly, irrefutably damning. Imagine the chamber where this pivotal document was penned. Not a grand hall, nor a consecrated space, but merely a cold, echoing stone room, illuminated by a flickering lantern, its table marked by the stains of wax and the weight of history. The year is 1308. The Pope has dispatched 3 cardinals to rigorously interrogate the highest-ranking leaders of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, Hugues de Perraud, and Geoffroy de Charnay, among others. The arrests remain a raw wound. The accusations swirl relentlessly. The King of France has already declared them heretics. Public opinion largely condemns them. The Church, however, is still grappling with its verdict. And here, within this fortress-turned-prison, the true deliberations begin. The Chinon parchment, as it is now known, was not unearthed by some dramatic Indiana Jones-esque adventure amidst cobwebs and pulsating music. It was discovered by sheer accident in 2001 by a meticulous Vatican archivist named Barbara Fraile. Simply misfiled, quietly resting in a mundane stack of routine correspondence, incorrectly labeled, overlooked for 7 profound centuries. What it contains is as astonishing as its remarkable survival. The document meticulously records that the 3 cardinals, acting directly on behalf of Pope Clement V, formally absolved the Templar leaders of the charge of heresy. They listened to their confessions. They carefully weighed their words. And then, unequivocally, they forgave them. This was not a pardon born of political expediency, nor a clever legal evasion. This was a clear, unambiguous statement. These men were not guilty of the spiritual crimes for which they would later be brutally executed. Allow that chilling realization to settle for a moment, for it ultimately mattered for naught. You see, while this absolution transpired in 1308, it never permeated public consciousness. It was never publicly proclaimed. It was never incorporated into the formal proceedings at the Council of Vienne. It was never invoked to prevent the agonizing burning of Jacques de Molay 6 long years later on an island in the Seine. The Chinon parchment was signed, sealed, and then systematically shelved. Some scholars speculate it was merely forgotten, dismissed as bureaucratic detritus. Others, more ominously, believe it was deliberately suppressed, its implications deemed too dangerous, its contradictions too vast and inconvenient. How could the Church possibly justify executing men it had already formally forgiven? How could it ever explain such a profound, damning silence? There is a faint whisper within that aged paper. One can almost hear it when imagining the scribe dipping his quill, meticulously transcribing the testimonies, the names, the very words of absolution. Perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps he cast a cautious glance around the cold room. Perhaps he knew, with chilling certainty, that this document would never see the light of day. But he wrote it nonetheless. Even more profoundly haunting, the Templar leaders themselves also signed it. Their marks, faint and formal, rest just above the final seal. For them, it was profoundly real. They truly believed their words would hold weight, that this hearing represented their salvation. But history, with its relentless and often cruel currents, had entirely different plans. And one must question, why Chinon? Why not the grander, more central Avignon or Rome? The choice initially appears peculiar until one recalls the extreme sensitivity of this matter. Chinon was indeed under French control, yet sufficiently removed from the immediate, pervasive influence of Paris. It was remote enough to maintain an air of clandestine quietude, yet official enough to lend an aura of legitimacy. A stage, meticulously set for truth, then hastily dismantled once the curtain fell. The timing, too, is critically important. When the Chinon interrogations were conducted, public sentiment was already subtly shifting. Some nobles had begun to quietly question the legality of the arrests, the brutality of the methods, the unsettling abruptness of the entire affair. And Pope Clement, perhaps genuinely uncertain of the Templars' true guilt, was still diligently gathering facts. The Chinon parchment could have served as the cornerstone of a profound reconciliation. It could have saved countless lives. But it did not. Instead, the king's voice grew louder, more insistent. France's coffers remained stubbornly empty. The public, manipulated by royal propaganda, craved closure, and Philip IV knew precisely how to script the ending he desired, with fire. Still, the parchment endured. It is composed of sheepskin, as were most documents of its era, and bears an ink that has deepened with age, yet remarkably has not faded. The Latin is dry, formally precise, yet utterly unmistakable in its meaning. The Church knew, and for 700 profound years, it deliberately withheld this truth from you. Imagine that, 7 long centuries of silence, with the truth patiently residing in a misfiled folder, not concealed within some shadowy crypt or forgotten chest, but merely in a drawer, waiting for someone to care enough to actually read it. And when it was finally unearthed, the Vatican did not issue a triumphant press release. There was no grand official revision of the Templar narrative. The parchment was quietly authenticated, quietly digitized, and then quietly acknowledged. In a strange way, this feels entirely fitting. The Templars lived and died in the liminal spaces between church and state, between fervent faith and cold finance, between vigilant protection and insidious suspicion. Their absolution, much like their ultimate downfall, existed within a haze of political maneuvering and bureaucratic paper. They were exonerated by ink, then tragically consumed by fire. You trace your finger along the imagined edge of that parchment, its surface undoubtedly rough and stiff with the passage of time. You ponder how many hands might have touched it, how many eyes might have perused it without truly grasping the monumental significance of what they held. Perhaps some did understand and deliberately chose to remain silent. The Chinon parchment compels us to reframe everything. The trials, the verdicts, the executions, they were not acts of justice. They were a meticulously choreographed performance. The outcome, it becomes chillingly clear, was already preordained. The truth was merely an inconvenient footnote, too delicate for an era consumed by anger. And yet, that fragile footnote stubbornly survived. In forthcoming revelations, we will witness how this singular document transformed into a ghost at the feast, haunting subsequent papal decisions, creating subtle yet pervasive fractures in the Church's officially sanctioned memory. But for now, allow it to stand in its solitary power, echoing from a dark room within a quiet fortress, where 3 men tragically believed they were finally being heard. It is not merely the parchment that whispers, it is what it represents, the enduring hope that truth, however briefly acknowledged, might still leave an indelible trace. And in the dust of Chinon, it undeniably did. You now find yourself in a narrow room, its walls meticulously lined with drawers that hum with a profound silence. Each drawer bears a label in precise handwritten Latin, bulla, decreta, acta. To the untrained eye, it all appears utterly innocuous, just paper in boxes, wax under glass. But experienced archivists possess a deeper understanding. They know that a sealed envelope, particularly one originating from the 14th century, is not merely an artifact. It is, in a profound sense, a warning label in disguise. Somewhere within a regional archive just outside Poitiers, a diligent clerk unearthed one such envelope, crafted from stiff parchment and sealed with crimson wax, now cracked like parched desert earth. It bore the unmistakable signum of Béranger Frédol, a cardinal closely allied with Clement Fingfeu and a pivotal figure in the Templar inquiry. The envelope was unambiguously labeled ad non aperiendum sine licentia papae. Do not open without papal permission. But genuine papal permission has been a rarity since 1378. So, they opened it. The contents were not grand, no earth-shattering confession of guilt, no lost gospel, merely a single, tightly written letter, dated 1310, addressed to a bishop in Normandy. Yet its message sent an undeniable shiver down every spine in the room. The letter meticulously described a final judgment delivered orally to certain Templar knights, a judgment that acknowledged their spiritual error not as heresy, but as a deviation of practice born from ignorance. In essence, a reprimand, not a damnation. What rendered it truly remarkable, however, was the explicit instruction that followed. The bishop was explicitly told not to act. "You will not publish this," the letter commanded, "until instructed." That instruction never materialized. For 700 years, the seal remained intact. The letter remained unread, and its quiet plea for patience tragically transformed into a tombstone for a truth that might have irrevocably altered everything. You begin to discern a disturbing pattern. These were not merely lost documents in the conventional sense. They were intentionally paused, systematically set aside, deliberately deferred into profound obscurity. The purpose of the seal was not to protect the message, it was to delay its revelation. Consider the crucial timing. In 1310, the Templar trials had reached a fever pitch. Dozens of knights had confessed, some under brutal torture, others under dire threat. Heresy had become the ubiquitous word of the hour. Clement V himself was wavering, subjected to intense pressure from both sides. The French crown vehemently demanded executions. The Church desperately sought unity. And somewhere amidst this maelstrom sat letters like this one, bearing truths that were neither politically convenient nor ethically ignorable. It is here that undeniable historical fact intervenes. We know from meticulously preserved church records that Clement established a unique two-track system for managing the labyrinthine Templar affair, one public, one rigorously private. The public records presented stern declarations, convoluted procedural inquiries, and eventual, decisive dissolution. But the private records, scattered across letters like this one, subtly hint at something entirely different. Profound hesitation, unexpected forgiveness, and even palpable regret. Of course, no official admission of guilt has ever been issued by the papacy. That is simply not how the Church operates. It does not retract, it masterfully reframes. But this letter, crucially, reframes a great deal. It strongly implies that key bishops were explicitly instructed to wait, to withhold, to effectively bury the contentious question until the political winds inevitably shifted. And tragically, the political winds never shifted in their favor. Why was this letter sealed in the first place? Some suggest it was mere protocol, a rudimentary means of protecting sensitive communications in an era when mail journeyed by mule and interception was common. But then, why the explicit label forbidding its opening without papal license? Why was it meticulously filed under non-acta, non-actions, rather than within the bishop's routine correspondence register? Perhaps the answer lies not in what the letter said, but in what it prevented. Had the bishop publicly disseminated the absolution locally, it could have spread like wildfire. It could have swayed other influential clergy, ignited pockets of resistance, or sparked widespread public doubt. Philip IV could not afford such a disruptive outcome. Neither, it appears, could Clement, and so the seal remained unbroken. The wax hardened, The paper yellowed, and the profound truth within fell into a centuries-long slumber. This is not an isolated instance. In Aragon, another sealed document was discovered in a monastery vault in the late 1800s, addressed to a Templar knight named Ramon de Serignac. It congratulated him on his acquittal and explicitly instructed him to await reassignment. The reassignment, predictably, never arrived. No one can ascertain if the letter ever reached him, or if he tragically died, believing he had simply been forgotten. Then there is the record from Metz, within the Holy Roman Empire, where a bishop writes of receiving sealed directives from Rome concerning the local Templars. Those directives, he claims, never arrived. No one knows their content, or whether they were intercepted, deliberately delayed, or quietly destroyed. You begin to grasp how history does not simply vanish. It is systematically sealed away, meticulously filed, meticulously locked behind layers of ceremony and rigid protocol, until it becomes so ancient, so utterly silent, that no one dares to disturb it. And when it is finally disturbed centuries later, it feels as though a ghost is whispering directly into your ear. The Poitiers letter now resides in a climate-controlled drawer, its wax fragments meticulously preserved under glass. The seal itself narrates a compelling story, an image of St. Peter holding the keys of heaven, now tragically cracked through the middle. One must wonder if anyone in that distant past truly comprehended the full weight of what they were sealing. Did Béranger Frédol pause before pressing his ring into the soft wax? Did he feel, even for a fleeting second, that he was bottling a profound contradiction, too heavy to contain? There is an undeniable finality to a seal. It unequivocally implies authority, absolute control, an end to all questioning. But what transpires when that seal shatters? When someone, centuries later, lifts the flap and discovers a message that irrevocably rewrites the past. In this instance, nothing explosive occurred. No revolution, no Vatican apology, merely a subtle ripple in the relentless currents of history. A footnote with teeth, a stark reminder that the narrative we so readily accept is often merely the version that fortuitously reached us, unburned, unbroken, and unsealed. And behind every version that endures, there are countless others still meticulously folded, still patiently waiting in the next archive, the next drawer, the next broken seal. The room, though smelling of parchment and beeswax, carries a subtle undercurrent, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of fear. Ancient, well-aged, like fine wine transmuted into vinegar. In your mind's eye, you stand within the royal chancery of early 14th century France, the very nexus where Philip IV, forever remembered by history as Philip the Fair, orchestrated one of the most audacious and aggressive campaigns of political sabotage the medieval church would ever endure. And somewhere within this very room, tucked amidst tax decrees and property registers, lies a letter never intended to be seen beyond his closest, most trusted inner circle. It is short, blunt, almost cruelly efficient in its directive. Dated mere months before the mass arrests of the Templars in 1307, the letter is addressed to Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief legal advisor and a man renowned for possessing all the warmth of a wet stone. This memo, recovered from a collection of personal documents within the French National Archives in 1895, was initially dismissed as routine. However, upon closer, more meticulous examination, its true import became terrifyingly clear. In it, Philip explicitly instructs Nogaret to ensure the coordination of local inquiries in such a way that public panic shall be avoided until the appropriate hour. More disturbingly, he mentions the redistribution of detained assets, not, as one might logically expect, after the conclusion of a trial, but chillingly in anticipation of the arrests. The precise wording unequivocally suggests that a definitive decision had already been made. The knights' guilt was a foregone conclusion, their fate sealed before any pretense of justice. This is not merely an order for investigation, it is a clear, unequivocal order for cleanup. You pause, for this detail fundamentally alters the historical landscape. Historians have long debated whether Philip genuinely believed in the charges leveled against the Templars, or if he cunningly fabricated them as a ruthless means to cancel his massive debts and seize their vast properties. This letter, while not definitively resolving that enduring debate, undeniably lends significant weight to the latter theory. It portrays Philip not as a reluctant monarch grappling with complex theological confusion, but as a cold, calculating tactician, meticulously preparing for an unparalleled land grab. And then there is the phrase, ensure the spiritual justifications are documented in accordance, not discovered, not debated, but documented. The Templars, it becomes chillingly clear, were already condemned in effect. Philip possessed compelling reasons for his audacious actions. His costly wars with England and Flanders had severely depleted the royal treasury. He had already, in 1306, expelled the Jewish population from France, seizing their wealth. The Templars, with their immense riches, formidable organization, numerous castles, vast landholdings, widespread influence, and, perhaps most crucially, their extensive international reach, were the logical next target. If Philip could shatter their power, he would send an unequivocal message to every noble in France. No one, absolutely no one, stands above the crown. However, dismantling them required far more than mere swords. It demanded a meticulously constructed narrative. This is where Nogaret's sinister genius came into play. A master of legal manipulation, he understood that to effectively dismantle the Templars, they had to be portrayed as more than just inconvenient. They had to be transformed into monstrous heretics. Accusations of heresy were perfectly suited to this purpose. They evoked widespread revulsion and profound fear. Best of all, such charges cleverly bypassed the need for standard legal trials. Accused heretics could be mercilessly tortured, their confessions accepted under duress, and their property summarily seized. You recall the desperate confessions from our earlier exploration, the men in Chinon who pleaded to be heard. The king's chilling memo, unearthed centuries later, unequivocally confirms what they likely already suspected. No one was truly listening. There is a cruel, almost elegant precision in how Philip orchestrated the arrests. On October 13, 1307, a Friday, a date that would later contribute to the enduring superstition surrounding Friday the 13th, hundreds of Templars were seized across France in a meticulously coordinated strike. The papacy was informed after the fact. Pope Clement V, caught entirely blindsided, made valiant attempts to assert control over the subsequent trials, but found himself repeatedly outmaneuvered by the king's ruthless efficiency. Philip possessed the undeniable momentum, the manipulated public, and the meticulously prepared paperwork. And, as this memo reveals, he apparently possessed the foresight to draft such damning instructions. The original copy of Philip's instruction to Nogaret mysteriously vanished sometime in the late 17th century. The version we possess today derives from a meticulously crafted 16th century copy, carefully entered into a legal archive in Bourges. Marginal notes from the original scribe include a hesitant, almost fearful line, "If this is true, then judgment was not divine but royal." Of course, nothing in the memo explicitly states, "Frame the Templars." Philip was far too cunning for such blatant directives. But the language, undeniably, is premeditative. There is no discussion of genuine guilt, only of process, predetermined outcome, and logistical execution. Even today, the Church rarely comments on this unsettling document. It is not, technically, part of the ecclesiastical record. It belongs to the royal files, an internal memo between a king and his ruthless fixer. But its mere existence profoundly complicates every other page, every coerced confession, every tragic burning, every pervasive silence. It also adds yet another chilling layer to the Chinon parchment. Recall the absolution issued there. It was quiet, private, utterly lacking in effective power. Was it because the Pope already knew even then that the inexorable machinery of destruction had advanced too far? That Philip had meticulously constructed his narrative, and no parchment, no seal, no whispered absolution could possibly halt its relentless progression. There is a fine line between dispensing justice and orchestrating theater, particularly when kings are involved. And Philip IV was an undisputed master dramatist. He meticulously staged the arrests, skillfully managed the public perception, and fundamentally reshaped the entire conversation. Even the surviving Templars, many of whom were simply pensioned off into profound obscurity, found themselves effectively erased, not by fire, but by deliberate irrelevance. Imagine the precise moment that letter was delivered to Nogaret, perhaps nestled within a velvet-lined pouch, perhaps sealed with a crimson ribbon. Perhaps he opened it with a small, tight smile, knowing precisely what was being demanded of him. Perhaps he did not flinch. And now, centuries later, here you stand, reading its chilling echo, feeling the profound coldness embedded within its calculated phrases, the unsettling certainty in its tone, the absolute finality inherent in its meticulous planning. The king did not require the church to uncover guilt. He merely required it to remain silent for a sufficient duration. And for a considerable period it did. For a long time, it was convenient to perpetuate the fiction that the Templar downfall was a uniquely French affair. A malevolent king, a timid pope, a convoluted entanglement of avarice and theology, neatly confined within the geographical boundaries of France. However, truth possesses an uncanny ability to bleed through the margins. If one meticulously follows the threads beyond the Seine, eastward, southward, and across the Channel, an unsettling reality emerges. Something was stirring in other lands too. Something coordinated. Something far more expansive. Our investigation begins in England. In early 1308, mere months after the mass arrests in France, Edward II received a formal letter from Pope Clement V, strenuously urging him to undertake similar decisive action against the Templars. Initially, Edward hesitated. He even dispatched a reply expressing profound doubts regarding the accusations. He unequivocally labeled the charges unfounded and conspicuously noted the order's long-standing history of unwavering loyalty. But then something inexplicable changed. Within weeks, Templar properties across England were systematically placed under lock and key. The Knights, though not subjected to the horrific burnings as in France, were nonetheless imprisoned, rigorously interrogated, and their extensive assets summarily seized. The entire tenor of English policy had shifted sharply, not merely in law, but in the very language employed. Suddenly, ministers spoke of cooperating with the Holy See and maintaining the moral clarity of the realm. It is tempting to conclude that papal influence ultimately prevailed. However, tucked within the archives of Westminster lies a record of something entirely different, a crucial communication, not from Rome, but from Paris. A royal courier, dispatched directly from Philip IV, had met with English officials in late December of 1307. The notes from that clandestine meeting, though surviving only in fragments, contain one particularly striking phrase. What begins in France must not be allowed to be isolated. This sounds far less like a suggestion and far more like a deliberate, overarching strategy. Next, consider Italy. In Florence, a series of legal scrolls dated to 1309 document inquiries into foreign brotherhoods operating under false cross. The term itself is curious, clearly intended to obliquely reference the Templars without explicitly invoking their name. Italian city-states were notoriously circumspect when navigating the treacherous waters of church politics, preferring ambiguity over direct confrontation. Yet, across Tuscany and Lombardy, subtle, yet decisive, movements were undeniably underway. Templar commanderies were abruptly shuttered, their inventories quietly taken. And while overt arrests were rare, a chilling pattern begins to emerge. The order was being systematically erased through paperwork, not through brutal fire. In Aragon and Castile, events took an even stranger turn. The Crown of Aragon, under King James II, was initially profoundly reluctant to move against the Templars. He wrote to Clement in early 1308, expressing genuine confusion, even outright skepticism. But then, in a series of rapid, unexplained decisions, he ordered that Templar castles be secured and their members questioned for clarity. In one of the surviving court records from Zaragoza, a knight named Raimundo de Abadal stated that he and his brethren had been warned before the papal orders officially arrived. Someone had tipped them off. They had commenced burning sensitive records days before the royal inquest began, not out of guilt, but out of a profound fear that those records would be gravely misunderstood or maliciously misused. This raises a profoundly uncomfortable question. If the suppression was intended to be uniform and purely reactive, why were the reactions so strikingly similar across so many diverse kingdoms, often before official edicts were even delivered? Perhaps the orders did not emanate from a single, centralized source at all. Perhaps they originated from multiple corridors of power, each acting under the illusion of divine coordination, yet driven by intensely earthly concerns. One particular document in the archives of Valencia captures your attention. It is a letter, unsigned, but attributed by watermark to the papal nunciature. In it, the writer subtly warns a local bishop that the cleansing of the order is essential to the perception of unity among kingdoms. That phrase again. Perception, not truth, not justice, just the appearance of agreement. Across the Pyrenees, in Portugal, the narrative takes yet another intriguing twist. There, King Dinas staunchly resisted the call to dissolve the Templars. Instead, in 1319, he simply renamed them. The Order of Christ was born. Templar lands were strategically repackaged. Templar knights were reclothed in a new banner. Portugal's secret was thinly veiled, yet it proved remarkably effective. The church formally approved the arrangement. The king retained the considerable wealth, and the knights, crucially, retained their lives. No flames, no trials, just a masterful rebranding. You step back and begin to discern the outline of something far larger than mere fear, far grander than theological dispute. What began in France was not an isolated act of justice. It was a template, a meticulously crafted strategy, a rolling purge precisely tailored to the specific needs and anxieties of each kingdom. Some employed it to consolidate their power, others to seize vast tracts of land. A few, like Portugal, simply circumvented it with clever paperwork. And all of them, every single kingdom, received letters from Rome. Some historians label it a domino effect. Others use terms like spiritual containment or geopolitical compliance. But you know its true nature. It was a whisper campaign transformed into law. A quiet, insidious pressure that traveled faster than horses, not because it was shouted, but because it was clandestinely passed hand to hand behind securely closed doors. One country, one king, might have appeared paranoid. But when 5 or 6 began acting in chilling synchronicity, employing the same language, the same manufactured urgency, the same vague instructions emanating from the same confused pope, one cannot help but suspect a deeper, more sinister coordination. And yet, no master document survives, no global memo, no explicit record of the precise moment where it all coalesced. Only fragments, echoes like the letter in Aragon, or the courier's note in England. Just enough to unequivocally suggest that what transpired was not spontaneous combustion, but a controlled detonation. You return to the Chinon parchment, to the king's memo, to the sealed letters. Each once felt like a singular piece. But now, like threads drawn taut across a vast map, they begin to converge. The lines stretch outward from Paris, twist through Rome, and knot themselves into the forgotten corners of Europe you hadn't even thought to examine. The Templar trials were not merely a scandal. They were a meticulously orchestrated system. And that system did not terminate in France. There is a distinct creak to ancient chains, a sound forged not merely of iron but of power. You hear it echoing through the halls of every stone-walled prison, where a man awaits to confess what he may not truly believe. It is not the sound of inherent guilt. It is the chilling sound of desperate survival. And if you listen closely enough, the confessions of the Templars reverberate with that same harrowing sound through the centuries. We begin with Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, whose final moments in 1314 have transcended into legend. But years before the fire consumed him, he sat in a desolate cell, his face gaunt, his hands undoubtedly bruised, answering questions whose answers had already been preordained. His initial confession was brief and cautious. He admitted to denying Christ under duress, but later, with unwavering resolve, he recanted, declaring his words had been brutally forced. Then, under renewed, intensified pressure, he confessed once more. The records vividly illustrate a pendulum of guilt and innocence, swinging relentlessly not with the dictates of conscience, but with the searing pain inflicted upon him. Molay's is not the only such record. Hundreds of Templars were rigorously interrogated across France and beyond. Some confessed swiftly, desperately hoping for mercy. Others resisted valiantly, only to break after days, weeks, or even longer under relentless torment. What inextricably links them is not consistency, but an overwhelming desperation. And it is here that a crucial historical fact emerges. The vast majority of Templar confessions were obtained under extreme duress. Not all involved the brutal rack or the searing branding iron. Sometimes, prolonged sleep deprivation, absolute darkness, and starvation proved equally effective. Other times, it was the insidious promise of release. One knight in Poitiers was explicitly told that his confession would spare him. It did not. Another in Sens was promised freedom in exchange for implicating others. He named names, yet tragically died anyway. It is effortlessly easy, from the comfort of centuries, to interpret these confessions as unadulterated fact. Ink on parchment possesses an inherent finality, but that ink was often hastily scribbled by clerks explicitly instructed to capture the sense, not the precise words. Many surviving transcripts do not quote the Templars directly at all. They summarize, paraphrase, and translate local dialects into formal Latin. And in that very process, entire meanings subtly yet fundamentally shift. One document from Carcassonne presents a confession where the knight admits to spitting on the cross, a common damning charge. But a marginal note, likely from a scribe uncertain of the phrasing, reads, "He said he was told to make a gesture, but does not recall doing so." Fine. The profound difference between symbolic obedience and true blasphemy tragically hangs in that single, crucial line. And then, of course, there are the missing records. Entire testimonies lost to consuming fire, pervasive rot, or deliberate neglect. In the Toulouse archive, a binder meticulously labeled Templar Interrogations 113 No 8130 contains only blank pages. No one knows if they were deliberately erased or simply never copied over. Some speculate that damning details, whether in favor of or against the knights, were systematically removed by scribes operating under explicit orders to curate the evidence. After all, in a trial where the verdict was pre-written, the details simply had to conform to the script. This is not to assert that all confessions were entirely false. Some may have contained kernels of truth about internal discipline, pervasive secrecy, perhaps even unusual rituals profoundly misunderstood by outsiders. But even if portions were genuine, the harrowing conditions under which they were obtained irrevocably taint the entirety. And here is the even more profoundly uncomfortable truth: the Church knew it. A papal directive issued in 1310, meticulously preserved in a dusty volume in the Vatican library, ominously warns inquisitors not to employ excessive methods of persuasion. It then adds, almost as a chilling afterthought, that some may interpret this liberty as encouragement, which, in practice, it demonstrably was. But perhaps most revealing is the recurrent appearance of certain phrases. Over and over again, in testimonies from Paris to Marseille, knights confessed to denying Christ, kissing the base of the spine, or worshipping a head. The language is uncannily uniform, identical phrasing, identical alleged sins. Either the knights had been incredibly consistent in their blasphemy, or the scribes had been provided with a template. There is a modern term for this: leading the witness. But in the 14th century, it bore another name: saving the soul. After all, if the Templars were truly heretics, then extracting a confession, even under brutal torture, was considered an act of spiritual rescue. And if they weren't, well, God would ultimately sort it out. One particularly troubling testimony comes from a knight named Etienne de Fussigny. His records meticulously document 3 separate sessions, each yielding a dramatically different outcome. In the first, he adamantly denies everything. In the second, he confesses under mild correction. In the third, he bravely asks to amend his confession. His final recorded words are chilling. "I will say whatever pleases you, but may God hear the truth." You imagine the scene: a small claustrophobic chamber, a sputtering torch casting dancing shadows, a man too utterly tired to resist, yet too terrified not to. Around him, the scribes write furiously, the inquisitor nodding with grim approval. Truth, it becomes painfully clear, does not die in fire. It withers under relentless pressure. Even more troubling is how these confessions were utilized not to ascertain genuine guilt, not to guide reform, but to justify a decision already irrevocably made. The Pope read them, the King cited them, and future historians for centuries would lean upon them as if they were pillars of immutable fact. But you, standing now in the liminal space between the words, begin to discern the profound cracks. Earlier, we traced the glimmering absolution, the sealed letters, the King's damning memo. Each suggested that something far deeper was at play. And here, in these echoing confessions, we witness the ruthless efficacy of the machine. It operated not by irrefutable proof, but by relentless repetition, not by compelling evidence, but by sheer soul-crushing exhaustion. What ultimately matters is not that the Templars confessed, it is that no one believed their denials. In late 1307, he appears on a roster of papal legates journeying to Poitiers. 2 months later, he is listed as an observer in the initial Templar interrogations near Toulouse. In 1309, he is in Marseille, overseeing a secondary hearing for Templar captives. And in 1310, his signature is attached, albeit faintly, to a document processed through the English priory at Lincoln. This constitutes a remarkably unusual career path for a mere notary. The official narrative asserts that Imbert was dispatched to ensure procedural uniformity, to help standardize inquiry practices across Christendom. However, some historians contend that his true assignment was far more subtle, not to impartially investigate, but to meticulously curate, to ensure that the confessions collected, the questions posed, and the phrasing meticulously recorded all conspicuously aligned with an already established narrative. That narrative, as you now comprehend, was one of undeniable guilt. In one striking instance, a Templar knight in Burgundy vociferously objected to the precise wording of his written testimony. The transcript had him admitting to spitting on the cross, a ubiquitous charge, but he adamantly insisted he had merely acknowledged being accused of it. Imbert was present at this session. A chilling marginal note in his own hand reads, "Reframe to reflect understanding, not denial." This represents a quiet redaction, yet one with devastating implications. And this is not an isolated example. A document from the Lucca Tribunal in Italy contains a curious instruction: conform answers to the northern pattern. The phrase is vague, but scholars widely believe it refers to the standardized structure of confessions meticulously collected in northern France, where Imbert had been actively operating for over a year. The implication is stark. His involvement was not merely administrative, it was profoundly stylistic. The official story was being written with a chillingly consistent voice, and Imbert, it appears, was holding the pen. Furthermore, his trustworthiness was paramount. Repeated references to him in papal letters commend his discretion, his proven loyalty, and most tellingly, his alignment with the vision of His Holiness. Notably absent are any mentions of truth or factual accuracy. One must question how a single individual could wield such quiet yet pervasive influence. But perhaps that is the very essence of the trick. Influence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from behind the curtain. It signs the correct papers. It meticulously edits inconvenient phrasing. It standardizes heresy itself. And yet Imbert was not universally embraced. In a sealed letter from the Bishop of Girona to a fellow cleric, the bishop issues a veiled warning about a man from Avignon who smooths the parchment before the ink is dry. The metaphor is undeniably clear. Someone was meticulously manipulating the record before the truth could firmly settle. Whether that someone was Imbert is not explicitly stated, but the timing, the geographical proximity, and the broader context all point undeniably in that direction. Archivists employ a term, ghost editor. It refers to the unnamed hand that mysteriously appears across multiple documents, subtly adjusting, judiciously abbreviating, meticulously clarifying, but never, ever signing. Imbert, though leaving his name, often did so only in passing, as if he sought to be forgotten, yet just sufficiently remembered to control the subsequent narrative. You begin to discern his insidious work in places he never even physically visited. The standardized phrasing, the consistent structure, the repetitive accusations that by now feel more like a meticulously crafted script than genuine testimony. And always, always, his influence converges around the same few core themes: the denial of Christ, obscene rituals, idolatry. It is not that he invented these damning charges, but he undeniably helped give them enduring, insidious legs. Was he operating under direct, explicit orders, or was he simply a true believer, swept up in the inexorable tide of certainty that so often drowns out nuance? We may never definitively know. His personal correspondence is lost to time. His name conspicuously vanishes from official records after 1312. No burial site, no final appointment, merely a handful of manipulated manuscripts and a lingering trail of textual echoes. One theory posits he became profoundly disillusioned, quietly retiring, perhaps to a monastic life, burdened by the very machinery he had helped to operate. Another darker theory Hints he may have been silenced, that someone realized he possessed too much damaging knowledge. But no conclusive evidence supports either hypothesis. Only a profound silence remains. Still, his fingerprints persistently linger. You recall Etienne de Fusigny, the knight who declared, "May God hear the truth." His confession, too, bears the unmistakable hallmarks of Imber's pervasive influence. The specific phrasing, the precise sequence, even the marginal notes align chillingly with other documents bearing Imber's quiet hand. You begin to realize the Templar affair was not solely about burning men. It was fundamentally about meticulously writing a story. And Guillaume Imbert, the notary no one truly remembers, might well have been the story's chief, most insidious editor. In this light, he transcends into a powerful symbol, not of inherent evil, but of how bureaucracy can insidiously transmute into belief, how relentless repetition molds collective memory, how a name, when whispered often enough in the shadows, becomes a pervasive ghost in the historical record. Thus, you remain vigilant now whenever you turn a brittle page or meticulously scan a faded header. You search not for what was said, but for who ultimately decided how it would be said. And more often than not, you find him. The fire was intended as the unequivocal end, a clean, definitive closure to a tumultuous chapter. Yet, as you stand at the edge of the Seine, where smoke once curled into the crisp March air of 1314, you come to a profound realization. It was not an ending. Not truly. If anything, it was an ellipsis, a lingering silence whispered in flame. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, represented the last resonant voice of the order's leadership. And when he uttered his final words, with flames licking at his robe and ash constricting his throat, those nearby claimed he did not curse. He did not plead. He cried out for justice. The precise content of his words depends entirely on the teller of the tale. Some accounts assert he cried, "God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon a calamity will befall those who have condemned us." Others contend he summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to divine judgment. Both men, as legend would have it, died within the year. It is tempting to dismiss this as mere myth-making. Medieval minds were drawn to patterns, to moral equations. The wicked fall, the innocent rise, even if only in memory. However, the strange case of Jacques de Molay defies such neat categorization, for in death, his narrative did not coalesce. It splintered. His initial confession, recorded in 1307, was notably vague. He admitted to denying Christ, but his phrasing was conditional. The record reads more like a paraphrased shrug than a firm statement of conviction. Days later, under more rigorous interrogation, he confessed again, this time with greater clarity. But months after that, he publicly recanted, unequivocally declaring his earlier confessions to be lies, brutally extracted from him through immense suffering. This cyclical pattern, confess, deny, repeat, became his agonizing rhythm, and it confounded nearly everyone, especially the meticulous clergy attempting to document his testimony. One scribe's marginal note reads, "He speaks in riddles, perhaps from pain." But perhaps it wasn't merely pain. Perhaps it was a deliberate strategy. Some believe Molay, a seasoned veteran of diplomacy and war, knew he could not emerge victorious. They suggest he gave false confessions, not to save himself, but to protect others, perhaps to strategically delay proceedings, to deliberately confuse the record, to buy precious time. His shifts in tone, therefore, may not have signified weakness, but a calculated, defiant resistance. What renders his case even more peculiar is what conspicuously failed to occur. Unlike other high-ranking Templars, Molay was not publicly defrocked. He was not handed over to a secular court until the very end. And his sentence, to be burned alive on an island in the Seine, came with alarming swiftness, almost as if someone desperately feared what he might still say. His final, courageous refusal to affirm the Church's predetermined verdict prompted immediate execution, bypassing the expected legal process. No more deliberations, no further appeals, just the consuming flame. But that fire ignited more than mere wood. After his death, copies of Molay's earlier absolution began to quietly circulate. One fragment, found centuries later in the Vatican secret archives, describes a closed-door meeting in Chinon in 1308, where Pope Clement V and 3 cardinals privately absolved Molay and several other Templars. They declared the knights guilty of grave imprudence, but not of heresy, not of damnation. They were to be reconciled with the church. So why was this absolution never honored? Why was Molay still imprisoned, relentlessly interrogated, and ultimately executed? The answer may reside in a single phrase from the Chinon document: pending political stabilization. It is an unusually secular inclusion within a spiritual judgment, but it reveals everything. The Pope knew the truth, at least the truth as his court perceived it, but he also understood the immense political cost of publicly declaring it. Philip IV had invested too much in the ruthless Templar purge. Reversing course could irrevocably fracture their already brittle alliance. And Molay? He became the ultimate sacrificial buffer between two immense powers, both more interested in preserving face than in uncovering truth. There is an obscure letter, buried deep within the Avignon archives, penned by a minor cleric named Bertrandon d'Artois. In it, he describes attending the execution and records what he thought he heard Molay say: "I die innocent, and I summon those who have condemned me to God's tribunal." But Bertrandon hesitates, adding, "It was loud. I cannot be sure." Yet, he concludes, "But the men beside me crossed themselves and went pale." That single sentence speaks volumes. It suggests a profound fear, not of Molay himself, but of being present when something inherently righteous was brutally crushed. And perhaps that is what most profoundly haunts history. The fire did not entirely end the Templars, but it did silence the loudest defender of their innocence. After Molay's death, the remaining members of the order either faded into obscurity, found refuge under new names, or dissolved into legend. But no one else possessed his authority, his clarity, his crucial timing. His death was the definitive period at the end of a sentence the church never fully dared to write. You revisit his image, a tall man, white beard, eyes singed yet unafraid. He does not scream. He does not curse. He speaks. And those who heard him remembered, though they may have later lied about it, though they may have redacted or softened the words, some truth irrevocably burned through anyway. It is there in the Chinon parchment, in the absolution never honored, in the Pope's chilling silence, in the King's desperate haste, and most powerfully, in the enduring question that even now we persistently ask: what did he really say? History tends to bury what it fears. But sometimes, in the desperate attempt to silence a man, you unwittingly render him immortal. When the word Templar is spoken, most minds immediately conjure images of lost gold, hidden hoards beneath grand cathedrals, secret vaults concealed within hillsides, or intricate treasure maps etched into ancient stone. And who can blame them? The allure of such a narrative is irresistible. But what if the true treasure was not metallic at all? You stand now in the shadow of a crumbling commandery, somewhere in Languedoc. Beneath your feet, there are no glittering coins, no gem-studded chalices, merely layers of dust and weathered stone, and, if fortune favors, a few brittle scraps of parchment, sealed within long-forgotten clay urns. No one here ever unearthed gold. But what was discovered, a fragment of a star chart, a prayer meticulously written in Greek, a coded diagram, half erased, linking solstice dates to lunar phases, is hardly pirates' loot. Yet it is profoundly curious, is it not? In the 13th century, the Templars were far more than just formidable warriors. They were extensive landowners, shrewd bankers, innovative engineers, and assiduous scholars. Their vast network stretched from the chilly coasts of Scotland to the sun-baked lands of Cyprus. Their numerous commanderies housed extensive archives, maps, intricate correspondence, crucial data, and profound knowledge, and in several instances, knowledge that appears remarkably ahead of its time. Consider the Clairvaux Codex. It was unearthed in the 18th century, tucked away within the private library of an abbey slated for demolition. The manuscript contains meticulously detailed notes on agricultural rotations, advanced water purification techniques, and, most curiously, precise geometric ratios employed in the construction of round towers. Nothing scandalous, nothing overtly magical, just startlingly sophisticated. The diagrams, unequivocally attributed to a Templar scribe, include explicit references to Arabic manuscripts and Greek philosophers. In the margins, Phrases are meticulously penned in Hebrew and Syriac. This knowledge was not necessarily original, but it was diligently collected, painstakingly preserved, and seamlessly integrated. Some scholars compellingly argue that this was the Templars' true mission, not conquest, but careful curation, not destruction, but profound synthesis. They journeyed through the Byzantine Empire, through the Levant, through regions where ancient learning had not been ruthlessly burned or dogmatically banned, but quietly yet steadfastly maintained. And perhaps, in their sacred campaign to protect pilgrims, they simultaneously became pilgrims of the mind. In a cellar beneath the former commandery of La Rochelle, restorers in the 1970s unearthed a carved stone slab featuring a circular design, a zodiac. But what truly captured attention was not the image itself, but its precise calibration. The intricate pattern suggested a profound understanding of the precession of the equinoxes, of axial tilt, of celestial cycles not easily observable without decades of meticulous, precise measurement. Too much, some argued, for medieval knights to comprehend. Unless, of course, they were not the originators of this knowledge, but merely its diligent custodians. You recall the charges ruthlessly brought against them, worshipping ahead, consulting spirits, drawing power from unnatural sources. But what if these were not heresies at all? What if they were profound metaphors for knowledge, for secrets carefully shielded from the common clergy? Inquisition records often conflated advanced learning with dangerous heresy. A Templar knight who diligently read Arabic texts might be accused of consorting with demons. A commandery possessing an astrolabe might be suspected of practicing divination. But perhaps the Church was not genuinely afraid of the Templars' beliefs. It was profoundly afraid of what they knew. A monk in Bologna once wrote that the order harbors questions that the Church dares not ask. He was reprimanded shortly thereafter, yet the unsettling questions persist. Why did so many Templar commanderies include dedicated scriptoriums? Why did they diligently maintain robust trading relationships with Islamic scholars even during periods of intense crusading? Why did some of their highest-ranking members specifically request burial without crosses? Perhaps they were not abandoning faith. Perhaps they were courageously asking what truly lay beneath its surface. The Church had consistently defined orthodoxy not by what was inherently true, but by what was politically safe. And in an era where translating a pagan text could lead to agonizing death by fire, intellectual curiosity was deemed profoundly dangerous. A knight who meticulously copied the stars, who painstakingly annotated Aristotle, who meticulously mapped winds, tides, and planetary conjunctions, such a knight would be perceived not as a scholar, but as an existential threat. Some believe this vast knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, architectural, was the true treasure hidden within Templar vaults. And when the arrests commenced, it was not merely coins that vanished. It was scrolls, sophisticated instruments, detailed maps, and precious manuals. There is a story, likely apocryphal, of a wagon that departed Paris mere days before the mass arrests. It was said to contain the wisdom of the order. Eyewitnesses reportedly saw cases, not typical chests, cylinders, not crates. The wagon was never seen again. But similar stories resonate in Castile, Tuscany, and Champagne. Always the same recurring theme. Profound knowledge moved under the cloak of darkness. Perhaps the vaults we tirelessly excavate now were never buried in the earth. Perhaps they were clandestinely hidden in mines, in remote monasteries, in libraries too obscure or too discreet to ever be thoroughly searched. Or perhaps the knowledge was utterly destroyed, not by fire, but by profound silence, deliberately forgotten, left behind like a sealed room no one dared to reopen. Even now, we fortuitously stumble across tantalizing traces, an Arabic translation in a Cistercian monastery, a lost Templar map charting the Canary Islands a full century before their official discovery, a set of construction techniques for Gothic vaults that no modern engineer can fully replicate. These are not mere relics, they are undeniable fingerprints. And they pose a deeper, more unsettling question. What else did they truly know? You glance back at the documents we have unearthed so far, the Chinon parchment, the sealed memo, the coordinated trials. A pattern indeed emerges. But perhaps we have focused too narrowly on the political destruction. Maybe that was only one facet of a multi-pronged agenda. Perhaps the rest, the part no one dares to speak of, was to bury the questions. Not the men, not the gold, but the very ideas. Imagine a dusty, quiet room, broken only by the faint scratching of a quill. A single shaft of light pierces a narrow window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. A monk bends diligently over a page, his tongue pressed between his teeth, meticulously copying a confession, carefully, deliberately, just as he has been explicitly instructed. But the ink on the page, you realize, is not always the complete story. For every interrogation transcript we read today, for every charter, absolution, or accusation that miraculously survived the centuries, there was a human being who chose to preserve it, or subtly alter it, or deliberately hide it. That, you understand, is where the story truly twists. Behind every Templar record stands not merely a knight, a king, or a pope, but a scribe. And these scribes, you now see, were not simply passive hands. They were the architects of memory itself. Consider the compelling case of Brother Amalric, a monastic scribe actively engaged at the Abbey of Saint Victor in Paris. In 1311, amidst the intense fervor of the trials, Amalric was assigned the task of transcribing testimonies from Templars held nearby. His official records are impeccably crisp, clean, and consistent. However, one particular page, almost discarded during a 19th century restoration, revealed something extraordinary. On its reverse side, faint and cramped, Amalric had meticulously copied a second version of the very same testimony. The wording was subtly different, notably softer. It unmistakably implied coercion, doubt. Why copy both? Perhaps Amalric was hedging his bets. Or perhaps, knowing what would be officially demanded of him, he diligently recorded both what he genuinely heard and what he was expected to record. In either scenario, it profoundly reveals the perilous position scribes occupied. They were the silent keepers of contradiction, and sometimes the only ones left who truly knew where the lines had been deliberately blurred. Another intriguing figure is Matteo of Siena. Little is known about him save for his distinctive signature, a looping M adorned with a diagonal cross. His unique handwriting appears in at least 9 Templar-related documents across Italy. But what is truly remarkable is not merely the volume, but the profound continuity. In each transcript, certain phrasing remains constant: bound by faith and office, compelled in spirit, but not in truth, told to say. These are not standard inquisitorial phrases. They are signals, quiet protests, or perhaps subtle shields. In a scroll miraculously recovered from the Monieux ruins, an unnamed scribe notes, "This was spoken under fear." The line is discreetly tucked between legal formulae, almost invisible, yet it speaks volumes. It reveals that even as the relentless machinery of prosecution churned onward, some individuals within it bravely attempted to leave subtle breadcrumbs. Not outright resistance, perhaps, but undeniable witness. Others ventured further. The monastery of Figeac diligently preserved a collection of Templar inventories, meticulous lists of books, relics, tools, and garments seized from various commanderies. But clandestinely hidden within the binding of one ledger, restorers discovered a sheath of notes, meticulously detailing which items were not reported. An astrolabe in brass, a scroll with unchristian diagrams, an Eastern idol of unknown name. These items, the note explicitly states, were given to a traveling priest for safekeeping. The note concludes with a cryptic phrase, "Truth should not perish with possession." Possession, not confession, not belief. As if knowledge, dangerous, foreign, unprocessed, was the entity most likely to be consumed by fire. And yet, not all scribes resisted. Some leaned into the prevailing narrative. A cleric named Bernardus, working under Bishop Guillaume of Paris, was renowned for skillfully stylizing testimonies to conform to the proper rhythm of repentance. His records frequently feature ornate language, transforming plain, unvarnished speech into dramatic, almost theatrical contrition. One knight's testimony begins simply, "I was told to spit," but Bernardus renders it, "I wept as I denied him thrice, as Peter once did, fearing my flesh would fail." Poetic, entirely fabricated, yet profoundly compelling. This masterful blending of editorial flair with a predetermined spiritual narrative served a crucial purpose. It rendered the confessions more persuasive, not to the accused, but to the audience, to those who would later peruse the scrolls and solemnly nod, genuinely believing they witnessed irrefutable evidence of sin, rather than the calculated storytelling of state-sanctioned guilt. That, in essence, is what the archive represented in many locations, not merely a repository of immutable truth, but a carefully curated memory. A monastery in Navarre, for instance, meticulously maintained two ledgers, one official, one private. The official ledger adhered strictly to the party line. The private ledger did not. It painstakingly recorded doubts, unsettling contradictions, and testimonies that simply refused to align with the accepted narrative. Over time, both ledgers expanded, sometimes in tandem, sometimes in direct conflict. In 1703, a Jesuit scholar reviewing the pair wrote, "It is as if the truth stood next to a mirror, and we must guess which is which." And guess we must, for in many instances, the scribes who dared to preserve conflicting truths were cautious enough to remain anonymous, their marginalia unsigned, their edits subtle, their rebellion quiet, yet undeniably visible. Every time a Templar confession abruptly ends mid-sentence, every time a name is meticulously crossed out and replaced, every time a translation deliberately favors metaphor over clarity, you sense a scribe behind it, making a crucial decision about what would ultimately survive. Some acted out of unwavering duty, some out of profound fear. But a select few, just a handful, appear to have acted for posterity, so that someone, someday, might look back and realize that the official record was never neutral, that the archive was, in fact, a battleground, and that truth had to be clandestinely smuggled into the margins. And here you are now, centuries later, meticulously following that very trail. You began with papal letters, with the grand machinations of kings and grand masters. But now you sit with the true architects of the archive, the ones who meticulously inked our collective memory, stroke by careful stroke. And in their profound silence, in their tiny, almost imperceptible annotations, you begin to discern a different kind of confession, not of sin, but of insidious complicity. At first, it is almost imperceptible, a faint crescent delicately scratched into the corner of a parchment. It isn't inked, merely indented. You angle the page towards the light, and the subtle groove catches your eye. Just a crescent. No explanation, no context. But then you discover it again, on another document. Different scribe, different location, yet the same distinctive crescent. And then again. That is when the slow unraveling truly begins, a thread hidden not in words, but in symbols, tiny, marginal, and often invisible, unless one knows precisely what to seek. The Templar archives are frequently treated as purely textual repositories, interrogation records, ledgers, letters. However, scribes, particularly those with rigorous monastic training, did far more than simply write. They marked. They encoded. And some of those marks simply do not conform to the traditional grammar of the page. A leaf-shaped flourish subtly placed beside a knight's name, a distinctive double cross-stroke beneath a date, a precise sequence of dots along the edge of a line that requires no ostentatious embellishment. Perhaps harmless scribal quirks, or perhaps a clandestine language embedded within the language itself. Paleographers refer to these as sigla, shorthand signs employed by scribes to conserve time or denote significance. But some of the sigla found in Templar-related documents do not correspond to any known shorthand system. One meticulous Vatican archivist in the 1950s cataloged over a dozen recurring symbols found only in records pertaining to the trials. None appear in unrelated church texts from the same period. Consider the double square. It manifests on at least 7 French testimonies, invariably situated in the top right corner and never explained. In one instance, it resides beside a sentence later redacted. In another, it appears beside a name conspicuously crossed out in red ink. This persistent pattern unequivocally suggests it was not merely decorative, it was directive. Perhaps a code for review, for deletion, or for profound doubt. Then there is the circle and slash, carved rather than drawn, typically appearing near mentions of absolution or secrecy. In one extraordinary case, it appears next to the Pope's own comment on the Chinon parchment, almost like a defiant footnote of dissent. But it is unsigned, unexplained, utterly anonymous, which is in itself profoundly telling because scribes were expressly forbidden to editorialize. Their sacred duty was fidelity, precision, and absolute silence. Yet human hands, even when ostensibly obedient, sometimes hesitate. And in those very hesitations, those clandestine marks, one discerns the quiet whisper of agency. One document in Avignon includes a confession with a marginal X beside the line, "I worshipped a head." But not just any X. It is drawn over the word worshipped. And then, in minuscule script, someone has added, "or was said to." This is not a clerical error. It is a correction, a protest, or a plea. In the Salamanca archives, another intriguing twist emerges. A Templar charter unrelated to the trials includes a geometric spiral in the margin beside a passage on relics. When meticulously analyzed under ultraviolet light, a second spiral appears, smaller, layered into the ink's iron content, utterly invisible to the naked eye. Someone, it seems, embedded meaning beneath the text itself. A scholar in 1991 proposed that these marks formed a kind of symbolic descent network, a clandestine method for scribes and clerks to communicate beneath the official narrative, flagging inconsistencies, objections, or profound doubts. It remains an unproven theory, yet it is undeniably compelling, because once you begin to perceive these symbols, you cannot unsee them. And it is not merely visual. Certain phrases repeat in remarkably unusual contexts. Under compulsion, he spoke as he must. Or, the tongue moves quicker than the soul. Shinch. These are not standard legalisms, they are literary, poetic, and they frequently appear in documents bearing the same recurring marks. A form of code, perhaps, not to hide the truth, but to keep it subtly breathing. You recall Matteo of Siena with his distinctive looping M. His documents bear 3 such symbols, invariably positioned near lines denoting coercion. And that faint crescent, you have now discovered it in French, Italian, and Aragonese records. Different hands, yet the same distinctive curve. So, what do they signify? No one knows with absolute certainty. But the very repetition strongly suggests something shared. A culture, perhaps, among scribes and archivists who were not entirely at ease with what they were being asked to meticulously record. Men of faith, certainly, but also of profound conscience. And when the system demanded absolute silence, they bequeathed symbols instead. A curved leaf in Rome, a triple dot in Toulouse, a faded star in Cyprus, tiny, almost imperceptible rebellions. And not all symbols were inherently critical. Some appear designed to protect. In the margins of a Florence transcript, a tiny fish is drawn, an ancient Christian symbol undoubtedly, but its placement is peculiar beside a knight's claim of innocence. It is the sole mark on the page, quiet, almost tender. Others seem to meticulously catalog memory, a faint labyrinthine pattern, a mirrored numeral, a double-blind loop beneath a confession. You ponder, was this how a clandestine community of record keepers encoded what they dared not utter aloud? A network of silent witnesses, diligently preserving ambiguity within a system that ruthlessly demanded certainty. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is all mere coincidence. Perhaps we are merely overinterpreting what is, in truth, nothing more than the idle doodles of bored scribes. But even that theory falters when you return to a document from Rouen, a confession signed, sealed, and witnessed. Everything appears to be in meticulous order until you turn it over and discern something truly curious. On the back, scrolled in faded ink, are 4 chilling words. I did not believe. No name, no explanation, just that. You sit with that line for a long, reflective time. Because in the end, what these symbols reveal is not just about what transpired, but how people lived within the unfolding events. How they navigated a pervasive system of fear. How they meticulously carved truth, not loudly, but carefully, beneath the surface, beneath the sanctioned line. They could not halt the trials. They could not save the order. But they could leave a mark. And centuries later, here you are, tracing crescents and spirals in quiet defiance, reading not merely the archive, but the very margins of history. You unfold the map with extreme gentleness. It bears the unmistakable signs of countless hands, each crease a scar, each faded line a whisper from another age. The parchment carries the subtle scent of dust and ancient salt, its corners delicately nibbled by centuries of air and curious fingers. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than any other medieval chart, a scattering of familiar islands, wavy coastlines, compass roses turning like intricate flowers in the vast sea. But then, an anomaly catches your eye, a coastline that unequivocally should not be there. Specifically, the eastern shore of South America, drawn with alarming, almost impossible accuracy, a full century before anyone in Europe officially discovered it. This map, known as the Carta de Sabatier, stands as one of the strangest artifacts connected, however loosely, to the enigmatic Knights Templar. Recovered from the archives of a private Italian library in the 1800s, it bears no date, no attributed author, and no accompanying letter of explanation. However, in the lower left corner, there is a faint yet distinct watermark, a cross enclosed within a circle, uncannily similar to the known seal of the Templar commandery of La Rochelle. La Rochelle was no ordinary port. It served as the Templars' primary Atlantic base in France, a crucial departure point for trade, for transport, and, according to some theories, for escape. When the arrests commenced in 1307, this is where some believe the Templar ships covertly departed. Where they sailed, however, remains an entirely different, more profound mystery. Official history dictates that the Templars never crossed the Atlantic, that they vanished into trial records and enduring legends. But the map you hold seems to offer a stark contradiction. It depicts rivers, mountains, and a rough yet undeniably recognizable outline of Brazil's coast. Not a fantastical island or mythical Terra Australis, but a continent, a tangible, real one. And this map is not alone. A 14th century Portolan chart, unearthed in Majorca, undated and unsigned, also depicts land far to the west of the Azores. The contours are vague, but again, unmistakably continental. And in both cases, subtly tucked into the margins in pale archaic Latin, are strange notations. One translates loosely to lands reached by the bearded knights in white. Who were they? Some vehemently argue the maps were forgeries, later retroactively planted to stir controversy. But meticulous analysis of the ink and parchment definitively dates them to the early 1300s, before Columbus, before Cabot, even before the Norse rediscovery of Vinland was widely known. And once more, the Templar watermark appears, subtle yet unmistakably present. Of course, maps alone are not absolute proof. Anyone could have conjectured about lands across the sea. The concept of Western continents was not entirely unknown to classical geographers. But the sheer detail is what profoundly baffles researchers. These are not vague blobs. They depict inlets and promontories that modern cartographers did not confirm until centuries later. So, how could the Templars have possessed such knowledge? One possibility is that they did not generate it themselves, but perhaps they carried maps originating from others. The order maintained deep ties with Arab scholars, whose knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and geography far surpassed much of Europe's during that era. If Islamic sailors, or even Phoenician traditions preserved in Levantine ports, had indeed reached the Americas, the Templars might have acquired fragments of that lore, meticulously copied them, zealously guarded them. Or perhaps, as some daringly suggest, they ventured there themselves. There is a half-buried legend in Breton folklore of a white fleet that vanished westward, never to return. Another in Galicia speaks of knights who returned with seeds that did not match anything native. Maize, perhaps, or cacao. No solid proof, merely tantalizing echoes. But what renders the map even more mysterious is the cryptic note on its reverse. Not for translation, only for the East Gate. The phrase is peculiar. It does not refer to any known geographic term. Some scholars believe East Gate was a code name, a signal to fellow Templars about a specific direction or a portal of profound knowledge. And it becomes even stranger. The identical phrase appears in a Templar inventory from Portugal, one chart of the East Gate to be held until the Feast of the Magdalene. Why a specific feast day? Why that precise phrasing? It unequivocally suggests ritual, timing, perhaps even a layer of secrecy beyond conventional concealment. Portugal, as fate would have it, became a sanctuary for former Templars after their brutal suppression. The Order of Christ, which many believe inherited Templar members and traditions, played a central, pivotal role in Portuguese exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, the very architect of the Age of Discovery, served as its Grand Master. And where, notably, did he construct his naval base? Sagres, the far western tip of Europe, where the sea whispers its loudest secrets, where one faces the vast, open Atlantic and perpetually wonders what lies beyond. It all begins to form a coherent shape, not a definitive conclusion, but a compelling question, shaped like a map. What if the Templars were the custodians of forgotten geographies? What if their archives contain not gold, but precise directions? And if that proves true, then perhaps their treasure was not hoarded at all. Perhaps it was sailed away. You reflect once more on La Rochelle, on ships quietly slipping away as the arrest loomed. No desperate cries, no overt resistance, just disappearance, vanishing with deliberate intent. And of course, none of this can be definitively proven. The maps could be misread, the watermarks misinterpreted, the notations mere coincidence. But when so many disparate fragments point to the same improbable suggestion, one is compelled to question. Not merely, did they sail west? But, what did they know before anyone else did? Because history invariably favors those who meticulously write it. And if the Templars were writing in maps, in code, in guarded circles of profound secrecy, then perhaps, just perhaps, they bequeathed to us something far more substantial than myth. They left us a question, a bold line drawn across the sea, daring us to follow. The trail now leads you far beyond the familiar confines of Europe, beyond the towering cathedrals and formidable castles, beyond the manicured French courtyards and the oppressive inquisitorial halls. You find yourself standing beneath a crescent moon in the faded ancient heart of Anatolia. The haunting call to prayer rises in the distant air, and the atmosphere carries the scent of exotic spices, dry dust, and something far older, something faintly metallic, like the lingering ghosts of chainmail, long since rusted away. For if the Templars truly vanished without a trace, the East is where many believe they may have ultimately gone. The Ottoman Empire, still nascent in the 14th century, had not yet swelled into the formidable juggernaut it would eventually become. The Byzantines, meanwhile, desperately clung to the decaying bones of their former grandeur. And between these burgeoning and fading empires existed pathways, ports, and forgotten places, ignored by empires, but not by the relentless currents of history. It is within these liminal spaces, coastal enclaves, treacherous mountain passes, ancient crusader outposts, that the first echoes begin to materialize. A monastic report from Thessaloniki in 1322 speaks of men from the west, disciplined in battle, who serve no banner but wear white. Another, from a Persian merchant's diary, mentions Latins residing in a fortress near the Cilician border, where they maintained a strict code and paid in silver stamped with a faded cross. He concludes, ominously, "They spoke few words, but knew our stars." This profound phrase, "knew our stars," reappears in a set of Byzantine naval records. Ships passing through roads in the early 1300s were boarded by men described as unaffiliated knights, bearing neither the cross of the Hospitallers nor the emblems of the empire. They requested not goods, but detailed charts, specifically charts of wind patterns in the Indian Ocean. You recall, from earlier sections, that the Templars were prodigious collectors of knowledge. And perhaps that is precisely what they were doing here. Not conquering, not merely hiding, but intently listening. There is a legend whispered among the dervishes of Konya. It speaks of white spirits with fire-forged swords who visited their lodge during the time of Sultan Orhan. The tale is shrouded in mysticism, yet curiously detailed in one specific respect. The visitors presented a gift, a box of scrolls, meticulously sealed with wax and bound with iron thread. The dervishes claimed it contained the map of the soul's journey. Likely a metaphor, yes, but even metaphors have discernible roots. In Ottoman archives, a partially preserved captured letter, now badly faded, mentions a group of Frankish knights offering their services to the court of Bursa in exchange for passage to the garden at the edge of the sea. The term garden at the edge of the sea is highly unusual. Some interpret it as poetic code for India. Others whisper it referred to a place even further east. Perhaps the strangest trace originates from a fragment discovered in a Syriac monastery near Lake Van. It is not a complete manuscript, merely a page, badly faded, yet bearing a list. Names. Latin names. Next to each, the Syriac equivalent. And beside that, a set of numbers, coordinates, and a simple note reading, "They arrived on the day the stars crossed." Could these have been Templars adopting local customs, re-identifying themselves in new languages, in new worlds? It is difficult to say, but the pattern is strangely consistent. Wherever records grow thin, these echoes begin to manifest. A Western name on an Eastern list, a coat of arms etched into an ancient caravanserai door, a whisper in a language not native to the place it is found. One must, of course, tread carefully here. The East is rich with captivating tales, and history has an unfortunate habit of absorbing the unfamiliar into local mythologies. But not all evidence is purely anecdotal. In the Topkapi Palace Library, amidst the oldest maps of trade routes and pilgrimage paths, there is a symbol that simply does not conform to Ottoman or Arab designs. It is a variation of the Templar cross, tilted, stylized, yet undeniably recognizable. The chart itself references a Brotherhood of the Flame, purportedly located near the Zagros Mountains, providing safe passage and honest trade. No known Islamic order claimed that name, which compels one to wonder, did the Templars fragment, yes, but also profoundly adapt? Did some of them, rather than fleeing westward, journey eastward, not as conquerors or exiles, but as astute travelers, diligently seeking continuity? Perhaps their fundamental mission outlived their official order. Perhaps their ingrained need for secrecy evolved from a strategic necessity into a deeply ingrained habit. And perhaps they chose not to rebuild their former structure, but to subtly integrate. We know that by the 15th century, the memory of the Templars had largely faded from the East. Their name held little meaning for most. But their persistent pattern, this discernible shape of silent movement, of guarded knowledge, of loyal brotherhoods who spoke little and traded in profound ideas, seems eerily preserved. And then there are the stone marks in a ruin near Antioch, carved into the ancient wall of an old way station, a set of concentric rings with 8 spokes. A design not unlike the Wheel of Time or the seal of certain esoteric Templar groups whispered about in 19th century occult circles. Could this be mere coincidence? Possibly. But then there is a second mark near Mosul, and a third, half submerged in a former Crusader fortress now inhabited by shepherds, where a circle encloses a chalice and a 5-pointed star rests beside it. And suddenly, these symbols in stone begin to appear less decorative. They begin to look like meticulously placed breadcrumbs. The East may not have served as a sanctuary for the order as a whole, but for those few who escaped with their knowledge, their secrets, and their convictions intact, it might have been the one place they could continue to move unnoticed, unburdened, and undisturbed. You breathe the arid desert air. You feel the profound silence stretching across centuries. And you listen to the echoes of men who did not vanish. They merely shifted direction. You walk through a narrow, vaulted chamber. The stones are undeniably ancient, yet distinctly non-European. There are no resplendent stained glass windows, no graceful flying buttresses, merely worn sandstone and a curious, hollow stillness. On one wall, a symbol is etched, weathered but strangely familiar, a pair of outstretched wings flanking a disc. Egyptian? Mesopotamian? It is difficult to pinpoint. What is clear, however, is that the very architecture hums with a profound purpose, not merely structural, but ceremonial. And as your eyes slowly adjust, you begin to perceive it. The strange, unsettling overlap between this chamber and a chapel you visited weeks earlier, one that once belonged to the Knights Templar. 2 temples, 2 continents, yet something inextricably connects them: ritual. There exists a theory, obscure, often dismissed, but persistently resurfacing, that the Templars inherited not only relics and vast real estate in the Holy Land, but also profound ritual forms far older than Christianity itself. That in the dusty, forgotten corners of Jerusalem's sacred sites, the Knights discovered not just history, but ancient patterns, rites, potent symbols, and architectural blueprints that predated them by millennia. And perhaps they quietly, yet profoundly, absorbed them. Begin with the layout. Several Templar chapels, particularly those in Portugal and southern France, conspicuously deviate from the standard Latin cross design. Instead, their circular or octagonal layouts are more commonly associated with Islamic architecture, and before that, with ancient pagan sanctuaries. The most celebrated example is the charola in Tomar, Portugal, a central plan supported by columns enveloped in an ambulatory space meticulously designed for ritual movement. Its proportions are almost identical to the Dome of the Rock, which once served as the Templars' headquarters. Coincidence or undeniable architectural memory? But it is not merely the shape, it is the action. Templar initiation rites, though largely undocumented and often grossly exaggerated by their detractors, reportedly involved a series of ritual denials, symbolic gestures, and movements performed in profound darkness. The descriptions are tantalizingly vague: a kiss, a touch, a whispered word. Critics vehemently denounced it as heresy. Yet ritual scholars discern something else entirely: echoes of ancient mystery cults, the Eleusinian rites, the Mithrite grades, even early Hermetic initiation practices. There is an account from the Inquisition that vividly describes a Templar chapel where no light was permitted save for a single flickering torch. Another details a black cloth draped over a column and questions asked in a language entirely unknown. The Church interpreted this as undeniable blasphemy. But the language, possibly Coptic, possibly Syriac, perhaps a tongue meticulously preserved from older initiatory practices, passed along not as doctrine, but as pure form. And what of the symbols the Templars employed? The cross pate, certainly, but there are other, more ambiguous marks: a double-headed eagle, a seven-pointed star, a serpent consuming its tail, the Ouroboros. These potent symbols appear in Middle Eastern Gnostic and pre-Christian traditions. One appears carved into a keystone above a Templar doorway in southern Italy. Another is found in the ruins of a temple near Palmyra. In one partially damaged manuscript, stored in the archive of Toledo, a diagram meticulously links the Templar cross to a Sumerian wheel of time. The lines connect with mathematical precision, too precise, some argue, to be accidental. This leads you to a more radical, unsettling question. Did the Templars, knowingly or unknowingly, preserve fragments of spiritual systems profoundly older than Christianity, systems ruthlessly buried by empire and strategically rebranded by doctrine? It is not a novel idea. Renaissance thinkers playfully flirted with it. 19th century mystics obsessively explored it. And modern historians, though exercising extreme caution, concede one compelling possibility. The Templars were exposed to an immense cultural cross-pollination in the Holy Land. They encountered Sufis, Gnostics, Jews, Nestorians, Zoroastrians. And in a world where salvation was passionately debated in a dozen different languages, they may have begun to perceive faith not as a rigid, straight road, but as an intricate, multifaceted mosaic. A Templar scroll from Cyprus, dated 1293, contains a prayer that strikingly blends Christian and Islamic motifs. It refers to the light that speaks in silence and concludes with a line: "As Abraham bowed to the unknown, so do we." The Church would never have sanctioned such evocative wording. But there it is, unequivocally in Templar hands. Even their curious reverence for John the Baptist, strangely emphasized in some regional commanderies, possesses older, profound resonances. John the Baptizer, the liminal prophet, a figure inextricably associated with the threshold between old and new. He appears in Mandaean texts, Gnostic scrolls, and Islamic teachings, all overlapping in themes of purification, secrecy, and the transmission of esoteric knowledge. So perhaps the Templars did not merely fight in the East. Perhaps they learned from it. And perhaps what they brought back was not merely gold or sacred relics, but profound patterns of thought, architectural blueprints of ritual, and concepts that stretched far beyond papal comprehension. This, then, may explain the intense paranoia. To the Church, ritual was absolute control. Deviations represented an existential threat. And if the Templars began to operate with forms no longer entirely Christian, or worse, forms that were too universal, then perhaps they were not merely a military threat. They were a profound spiritual one. Imagine a brotherhood that no longer perceived truth as monolithic, one that believed symbols could harbor meanings across diverse cultures. That initiation could unlock not loyalty to Rome, but to something deeper, older, more intrinsically difficult to contain. Little wonder they were so profoundly feared, and little wonder they were so ruthlessly erased. But here, within these hidden correspondences, in this strange architectural rhyming, you discern the faint, tantalizing outline of that other truth. A lineage not of rigid dogma, but of profound design. A knowledge of temples passed from hand to hand, meticulously rebuilt in stone and haunting silence. They did not create it, but they remembered it. And now, perhaps, so do you. The monastery was small, tucked high into the hills near the Loire Valley, an unremarkable structure by medieval standards. But inside, there was once a room lined wall-to-wall with shelves, a scriptorium where monks dedicated their lives to ink and profound silence. They diligently copied scrolls, meticulously cataloged letters, and assiduously preserved histories. Then, in 1327, it vanished. Not the physical building, the records were simply gone. No fire, no flood, no mention in royal orders or papal decrees. One day, 100 invaluable manuscripts existed. The next, a polite note in the monastery's annual inventory. This year, the scriptorium was found bare. No explanation. You linger on that phrase for a while. Found bare. As if the pages themselves had simply risen and walked away. Of course, scriptoriums were not eternal. Books decayed. Monks aged. Priorities inevitably shifted. But here's what renders this case truly unusual. This particular scriptorium had long been renowned for housing Templar material, letters from commanderies, crucial trial transcripts, even a partial register of oaths, an exceedingly rare item, believed to be used for internal tracking of knights' solemn vows. Its existence was definitively confirmed in a visitation report from 1318. The inspector noted that several volumes of Templar origin remain, though their use is now forbidden. He meticulously described seals in marginal notes. One book even bore a chilling notation that it was not to be shown to any outside the circle. And then, 9 years later, nothing. Not burned, not looted, not formally transferred, simply disappeared. This was not an isolated incident. A Carmelite priory in Normandy reported in the same decade the sudden, inexplicable loss of Eastern materials, including a set of scrolls believed to have originated from the Templar outpost in Acre before its fall. Again, no discernible sign of violence, merely a profound, unsettling absence. And in the Abbey of Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne, an inventory from 1331 lists a tome of the Crossed Knights in the possession of the abbot. 4 years later, in the subsequent annual list, no mention. And when queried by the bishop's agent, the abbot simply stated, "It is no longer necessary." No longer necessary. Tauersam. That phrase chills you more profoundly than any torch or blade, because it unequivocally implies decision, conscious choice, a quiet erasure enacted not out of fear, but out of deliberate design. What transpired in those crucial missing years? One theory posits internal purges, that as the political climate inexorably shifted, church officials, fearing a resurgence of Templar loyalty among sympathetic monks, covertly ordered the silent destruction of remaining documents. Another theory points toward the early consolidation of inquisitorial archives, material meticulously gathered, sifted, and buried in central secure vaults for safekeeping, buried so deeply in some cases that they have never surfaced again. But there is a third, more tantalizing possibility, that the scribes themselves liberated the texts. Imagine it. A young monk, perhaps once trained by a Templar chaplain, overhears ominous whispers. An order is imminent. The shelves are to be cleared. He waits until nightfall, gathers the precious scrolls, wraps them carefully in oiled skin, and clandestinely hides them in the root cellar. Or perhaps, over weeks, he transports them to a sympathetic house across the valley. Maybe he buries them. Maybe he burns them. Or perhaps he meticulously copies them first. There is no definitive proof of this, of course, but one surviving letter subtly hints at such a moment. It is unsigned, undated, written in the cramped hand of someone clearly unaccustomed to speed. The ink blots, the Latin is rushed, but the message is unmistakably clear. They will take what we do not hide. I have wrapped the oaths in cloth and sent them to the west. What oaths? Where precisely in the west? The letter never specifies. But nearby, in the margins, someone has drawn a cross. Not the standard Latin form, but a modified variant. A looped cross, similar to ones seen in Templar graffiti found in Portugal and southern England. A personal mark, perhaps. A poignant farewell. Even centuries later, the trail stubbornly refuses to vanish entirely. In 1802, a farmer outside Tours uncovered a clay jar beneath a crumbled wall. Inside, fragments of parchment so fragile they disintegrated upon contact with air. But one scholar managed to transcribe a single profound phrase before the letters vanished completely. The light remains in the silence. You can almost visualize it, a last, desperate gesture. Someone placing the jar into the earth, pressing it down with meticulous care, sealing it not with fear, but with an enduring hope. Because if the scriptorium truly disappeared, perhaps it did not die. Perhaps it merely moved. We often perceive knowledge as static, carefully preserved in rooms, copied in stillness. But the truth is, knowledge migrates. It hides. It survives. And sometimes, it disappears because that is the only way it can truly be safe. Even today, church archives contain meticulously locked collections, not sealed by damage or decay, but by deliberate choice. Dozens of Templar-related documents are known to exist only by their catalog entries, titles with no corresponding pages, boxes with no authorized access. Occasionally, a scholar fortuitously stumbles upon a page or two, but the deeper content remains shrouded in impenetrable shadow. Some attribute it to bureaucracy, others to pervasive fear. Because the question is not merely what the Templars knew, it is what others believed they knew, a power residing not in weapons, but in words. And if those words still exist, if they live in a forgotten cellar, a mislabeled shelf, or a fireproof vault, then perhaps the scriptorium did not vanish. Perhaps it simply turned invisible. You step back from the unsettling thought, from the silence of empty shelves, the blank spaces in the archive. And in that very silence, a message patiently waits. The cover is unassuming, aged leather cracked at the spine, bound with a clasp that no longer functions. There is no title, no emblazoned emblem, merely the quiet weight of something never intended for anyone's eyes, save for the hand that meticulously penned it. And yet, here it is, discovered, hidden inside the lining of an old trunk, unearthed in a Burgundian cellar, misfiled among wine inventories and receipts for sheep. This is the diary of Bertrand de Martel, Grand Prieur of Auvergne, one of the highest-ranking Templars in France at the time of the brutal arrests. No one comprehends how it miraculously survived. The document commences without preamble, no dear journal, no date, merely a chilling sentence. I will write what I dare not speak. You immediately sense the tone, tense, introspective, as if each word exacts a profound cost. This is not a chronicle of public events. It is a profound confession, though not the kind demanded by ruthless inquisitors. He describes the autumn of 1307 in cold, almost surgical fragments, the ominous knock at the preceptor gate, the sealed warrant, the expression on his brethren's faces as they were shackled without resistance. He writes, not of surprise, but of inevitability. We had long known we would be betrayed, only not when, not by whom. He avoids naming names directly, never Philip or Clement, only the crown and the robe. But his meaning is unmistakably clear. What is even more striking is his reaction, not anger, not even outright grief, but a profound, weary exhaustion. We were never meant to last. The fire was too bright and the room too small. Then, on the 6th page, a dramatic shift. He begins to describe a specific set of papers, meticulously stored beneath the altar of the chapel at Monsieur, bound in red leather and sealed with wax. He refers to them simply as the Concords. What precisely were they? From his fragmented notes, they appear to have been internal documents, a daring attempt by senior Templars to unify their understanding of certain truths acquired in the East. He alludes to divergent revelations, to conflicts between tradition and discovery, and to the desperate need to preserve without igniting the church. It reads like the minutes of a secret, clandestine council. And more revealingly, he admits, we did not all agree. Some believed the Concords should be burned. Others believed they were the very purpose of our survival. Bien, he never directly describes their contents, only tantalizing fragments. The measures of the stars, the stones that speak the name of the fire, and that which was written before Babel. But you stare at those words. They sound absurd, mystical, perhaps even entirely fabricated. But then you remember, Bertrandon de Martel was no fantasist. He was a meticulous administrator, a stark realist, a man tasked with managing farms, rents, knights, and commanderies across hundreds of miles. And yet, here he is, pouring ink into the margins of his exile to preserve something he could never utter aloud. He writes of dreams, of voices, of a night in Acre, when a stranger, with no face and 7 names, presented him with a piece of flint and declared, "This is your beginning." Again, poetic, symbolic, or a record of an actual cryptic encounter. The line between the spiritual and the tangible in these pages is profoundly porous. And then, perhaps most revealingly, comes a list. Short, stark, comprising 6 entries, written in a hand more rigid than the rest, as if copied from elsewhere. 1. The seal must be broken only at dawn. 2. The circle must never touch the cross. 3. He who drinks first must not speak. 4. The stars of the east guide the final gate. 5. The name is not to be written. 6. If the fire returns, bury the eye. You reread them again and again, and each time they seem to acquire a different, elusive meaning. Liturgical rules, coded instructions, ominous warnings. None make immediate, obvious sense, yet taken together, they strongly suggest a profound structure, a specific rite, a sequence of actions rehearsed in absolute silence. And just when you believe you have grasped the heart of the mystery, the entries abruptly cease. The remaining pages are blank, or rather, were blank, because under ultraviolet light, archivists in 1997 discovered faint writing in what was likely lemon juice or another organic ink, utterly invisible to the naked eye. Across 5 pages, Bertrandon meticulously penned a second layer to his diary, a postscript only readable if one knew precisely where to look. It is there that he describes the departure, not of himself, but of others. The brothers who carried the Concords beyond the sea. No names, no specific destination. Just this. They left before the harvest. 2 by land, 4 by ship. The one who could read the fire stayed behind. And then a chilling final line. If you are reading this, it means the circle has opened again. You close the diary slowly. The aged leather feels warm from your hands. The air, somehow, feels thinner, as if you have stepped through a veil, not into certainty, but into a deeper, more profound ambiguity. For now, the question is not merely what Bertrandon knew. It is whether the meticulously left trail he bequeathed was ever truly meant to be discovered, or whether it was a signal cast across centuries like a message in a bottle adrift on the tide, for someone, anyone, who might still possess the understanding. The scroll is short, barely the length of your forearm, and so tightly rolled it crackles ominously as you begin to uncoil it. The parchment is stiff with age, stained with water, and clearly marked by extensive travel. It carries a faint scent of clove and ancient dust. At the very top, in an uneven Latin hand, is the name Hugo de Aragon, knight and servant in Christ's pilgrimage. Zeo. Nothing remarkable at first glance, merely another Templar who, like many others, undertook a late-life pilgrimage after the order's brutal fall. But as you meticulously read, something profound shifts. Hugo does not describe the customary path to Santiago or Rome. He writes instead of strange borderlands, of meeting brothers who wear no cross but guard the gate, of passing through a region called Vallis Lucis, Valley of Light, a name found on no known map. And then there is the code. Midway through the scroll, Hugo's tone abruptly changes. The narrative fragments. Words transform into single lines, odd spellings, deliberate repetitions, a pattern that yields no immediate sense until you begin to meticulously track the frequency of letters and the precise positioning of the phrases. You realize, with a sudden jolt, it is a cipher, not a decorative flourish, but a deliberate, intricate one. This, you understand, is not a prayer, it is a key. Scholars who have painstakingly studied Hugo's scroll believe it is penned in a complex blend of early Latin shorthand, Arabic abjad numerals, and a sophisticated substitution system commonly employed in Levantine trade ciphers. This means Hugo was not merely a pilgrim, he was a courier, or something far more significant. You recall from earlier Bertrandon de Martel's diary, which mentioned, the brothers who carried the Concords beyond the sea. Hugo, it becomes plausible, may have been one of them, or at least in direct contact with those who were. And then you discover the clincher. In the ciphered portion, when painstakingly decoded, is a phrase that translates roughly to, "The ink is hidden in salt. The voice is hidden in dust." It echoes with chilling precision a line from the Syriac fragment found in Lake Van. The phrasing, though separated by immense distance in differing languages, is unmistakably familiar. Two Templar-linked texts, both referencing concealment through elemental metaphor. This, you realize, is not merely a poetic flourish. This is a carefully constructed language designed to guide someone who already possesses the crucial knowledge of what to seek. Further along the scroll, Hugo describes his arrival at a coastal fortress, its name sadly obliterated by damage, where he is welcomed by men who knew the right of silence. He writes, "We sat in the wind while the stars shifted. One by one, the old names were spoken again." The old names, possibly the same names recorded in the lost scriptorium, possibly those whispered during the initiation rites hinted at in previous chapters, possibly code names for the select few who continued the work in profound secrecy. Hugo also writes of carrying two pieces. That is all he calls them, no further elaboration. But he does note, one was too bright for ink, one too curved for script. What kind of pieces? If you return to Bertrandon's diary, one of the Concord's entries refers to that which bends light but holds none. A curious turn of phrase, often dismissed as mere metaphor. But Hugo's scroll strongly suggests otherwise. Perhaps the pieces were not written texts, but tangible objects, artifacts so strange or so sensitive that they could only be described in veiled symbols. And then he describes a ritual. Not in meticulous detail, he is scrupulously careful, but he mentions a bowl carved of 7 layers, placed beneath a cedar tree during the new moon. A name was whispered into it. Then the bowl was buried. This description almost precisely matches an initiation rite found in a Coptic manuscript recovered in Egypt, a ceremony involving a layered vessel, profound silence, and a spoken name. Again, the overlaps are too specific, too compelling to ignore. What unequivocally emerges is a vivid picture of persistent movement. Templars, or former Templars, did not merely scatter into exile. Some carried crucial instructions. Knowledge, meticulously encoded in scrolls, buried in compelling stories, hidden within ancient rituals. They passed this vital information along obscure routes, from Aragon to Rhodes, from Antioch to Portugal. Not a grand, overarching conspiracy, not a vast network of overt power, but a kind of silent relay. Each carrier passing the flame to the next, never quite grasping the full, immense picture. And Hugo, it becomes plausible, may have been one of the final links in this clandestine chain. His scroll ends abruptly. The final words are uneven, as if penned in haste. The salt is gone. The dust now speaks only to the wind. No signature, no farewell. But in the bottom corner, pressed lightly into the parchment, is a symbol, a crescent surrounding a cross. Not the typical Templar design, but a known variant used in Aragon during the late Crusades. And here is the truly strange part. The same symbol appears in a 20th century excavation report from Malta, carved into a stone fragment discovered beneath the crypt of a former Templar chapel. The carving was dismissed at the time as merely decorative. But now you wonder, could it be the mark of the couriers, a clandestine way to signal safe passage, much like the chalk symbols left by travelers on monastery doors? If so, Hugo bequeathed more than a scroll. He left a map, coded not in geographical directions but in symbols. A map of transmission, of enduring memory, of a vital message. The Pilgrim's Code, then, is not a single key, but many. Not a definitive solution, but a discernible shape. A way of understanding the flow of Templar knowledge, not as static information stored in vaults, but as a living entity, moving across generations, meticulously hiding in plain sight. And perhaps, just perhaps, it continues to move through old books, strange glyphs, and whispered names. You roll the scroll back up gently, carefully. The ink may have faded, but the message has not. Not for those who still possess the profound understanding of how to listen. Beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun, Malta appears immutable, solid stone and relentless salt wind. The city of Valletta rises like an impregnable fortress from the sea, all golden limestone and sharp angles. But deep beneath its intricate streets, beneath centuries of Crusader architecture, lies a vault few have entered and even fewer remember. You descend into near darkness. The staircase twists, dust stirs, and the air turns cool, then chillingly cold. Your steps echo, as if you are treading within the very bones of the island. Then, a sight of vaulted stone, arched like the ribs of a sleeping beast. This is the undercroft of a 13th century commandery, once Templar, later repurposed by the Hospitallers after the Templar arrests. For years, it was largely ignored, assumed to be little more than a mundane storage chamber. But in 1972, a team of local archaeologists was granted access as part of a routine structural survey. The objective was prosaic: assess stability, record minor findings, check for water damage. Instead, they discovered something entirely unexpected. The team, led by a historian named Dr. Elio Barron, uncovered a hidden subchamber beneath the southern wall. The entrance was sealed with rubble and loose mortar, yet it was unmistakably artificial. When meticulously cleared, it revealed a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for one person to pass at a time, leading into a hexagonal room, a design unlike anything in known Templar architecture. The walls were bare stone, save for a shallow recess on each side, 6 in total. In 5 of the niches, they found fragments, bits of wax, burnt cloth, and what appeared to be the shattered handle of a ceremonial dagger. In the 6th, nothing. But it was not what they found that precipitated the project's abrupt halt. It was what they felt. Multiple members of the excavation team later reported an overwhelming sense of pressure within the chamber. Not heat or suffocation, but a profound weight, as if the very walls leaned inward with unseen force. Equipment inexplicably failed. Lights flickered erratically. One archaeologist adamantly refused to return after the second day, citing a vivid dream in which the floor opened and a disembodied voice declared, "Not yours." Of course, this narrative sounds dramatic, superstitious even, until you read the interim report submitted before. The dig was officially shut down. In it, Dr. Barron meticulously mentions discovering an engraving of unfamiliar script on the ceiling of the hexagonal room. He describes it as consisting of looping arcs and intersecting lines, possibly Templar shorthand, possibly a pre-existing symbol repurposed by the order. The report includes a rudimentary sketch, a circle enclosed by 2 broken lines with a star subtly offset to the right. The central image, a single vertical eye. You have seen that symbol before in a Templar trial record from Toulouse. One of the accused knights is questioned about the sign of the open eye. He adamantly refuses to answer. The record chillingly notes he grew pale and would not speak further. But the most troubling aspect emerges from Barron's handwritten field notes, never publicly published, but obtained decades later by an independent researcher. In them, he writes, "There was something in the wall behind the empty niche, a hollow space, sounded like a chamber." He formally requested permission to open it. 2 days later, the dig was abruptly halted. Officially, the reason cited was a budget issue. Unofficially, the site was reclassified by the Maltese government and sealed. All documents were immediately moved to restricted storage. Barron never spoke publicly about the discovery again. You begin to discern the pattern, from the vanished scriptorium to Bertrandin's hidden diary, from Hugo's ciphered scroll to Malta's sealed vault. This is not a single act of erasure. It is a multitude of independent actions, scattered across time and territory, all converging toward the same unsettling conclusion. There is something within the Templar record that someone, perhaps many someones, does not want rediscovered. What was contained within that chamber? A reliquary, a scroll, a map, or something far stranger? Something inextricably tied to the concords, to the pieces carried west, to the rites deemed too perilous to be plainly recorded? Consider this. Malta served as the final stronghold of the Hospitallers, the very order that inherited much of the Templars' property. But persistent whispers, long denied, suggest that the transfer was not merely logistical, but profoundly spiritual, that certain rituals were passed along with the deeds, that a select few within the Hospitallers were chosen to carry the deeper tradition. This would explain why the chamber was constructed beneath a property that changed hands but not fundamental function. And it would explain the curious gap in the commandery's 14th century records. One moment, routine repairs are meticulously listed. The next, a profound silence, an entire year utterly blank. Back in the hexagonal chamber, the niches still reside in darkness. What was burned, what was broken, what was never placed in the sixth, we may never definitively know. But one phrase from Baron's notes profoundly resonates with you. If this is ritual, then it is older than Malta, older than the Order. A thing repurposed, like a stage awaiting actors who know the lines by memory. That sounds remarkably like something Bertrandon would have penned, or Hugo, or any of the others who left only fragments, like shattered glass reflecting a single, enduring flame. You ascend back into the light, your heart heavy with unanswered questions. If the vault remains sealed, it is not primarily because of what it contains, but because of what it might unequivocally confirm, that the Templars were more than mere knights, more than astute bankers, that they may have been, at their very core, profound keepers of ancient knowledge. It commences with a stone, weathered, embedded in a hillside in Newport, Rhode Island. Locals refer to it simply as the Old Tower. Officially, it is classified as a colonial windmill, nothing more. But something about its very presence feels inherently wrong. The arches are anomalous. The masonry appears far too ancient. Beneath layers of later repairs, the core construction seems to defy its purported 17th century origin. Then emerges the theory, dismissed by mainstream academics, yet fervently embraced by amateurs, that this is not merely some quirky windmill, but something far older, distinctly medieval, constructed by men who came not for conquest or settlement, but to indelibly leave a mark. Templars. Naturally, the idea appears outlandish. What conceivable reason would a 14th century knight possess to traverse the Atlantic centuries before Columbus? What ship could have carried them? What unfathomable purpose drove them? Yet, as one delves deeper, the theory begins to assume a compelling shape. First, the structure itself. Archaeological analysis has confirmed that the mortar in the tower's core differs significantly from later colonial mixtures. The precise placement of its windows aligns with solstice points, not mere utility. And then there is the legend, passed down through New England folklore, of the White Cross men who once visited the shore, traded silver with the local inhabitants, and departed before the first snow fell. Fanciful, likely, but not devoid of echoes found elsewhere. In the mid-1800s, a carved stone was unearthed in Westford, Massachusetts. It depicts a sword, a shield, and a helmet bearing a distinctive cross-shaped emblem. The carving, though rough, is strikingly deliberate. Beneath it, an inscription, eroded almost to nothing, has been interpreted by some as M. Sinclair. The name is crucial. Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, was a known associate of the surviving Templar networks in Scotland. After the Order's brutal fall, many knights found refuge in northern strongholds, safely beyond the reach of French and papal interference. Sinclair himself was reputedly a patron of exploratory voyages westward. His descendant, William Sinclair, would later construct Rosslyn Chapel, famed for its strange, non-Christian motifs and rumored secret vaults. Thus, the concept of a Sinclair voyage to a new land, potentially carrying Templar survivors, their knowledge, or precious relics, has captivated theorists for decades. And then there is the map. In 1957, a Norse-inspired document known as the Zeno Map mysteriously resurfaced. It depicts parts of Greenland and a mysterious landmass to the west, predating the official charting of those regions. Critics dismiss it as a forgery, but one detail stands out. A small cross drawn inland on what would now be North America, labeled only Templa. Not a city, not a region, but a temple, or perhaps a cryptic signal. Could the Templars have indeed reached the shores of a new world? If so, what were they seeking? Theories abound. A place to escape relentless persecution, a land unclaimed by Rome, a pristine continent where they could meticulously preserve the concords without fear of destruction. Or perhaps something far more mythical, traces of the antediluvian world, profound knowledge untainted by the corrupting influence of empire. And here is where it all becomes even stranger. Among the artifacts purportedly recovered from Templar sites in Nova Scotia and New England, several bear unfamiliar symbols: loops, crossed lines, stars. One precisely matches a glyph observed in Bertrand de Martel's hidden diary. Another is nearly identical to a mark pressed into Hugo's scroll. These are not medieval European characters. They are hybrid, as if two distinct traditions converged and a new clandestine language was born. Some dismiss this as mere fantasy, coincidence, or pseudo-history at best. But others argue that if even one Templar knight crossed the Atlantic, whether under Sinclair's patronage or by another's hand, then the implications stretch far beyond American shores. It would signify that the concords were not merely hidden. They were transplanted, meticulously planted like seeds in soil, untouched by papal power. And what might have blossomed there? You imagine a knight, cloaked in worn linen, kneeling on unfamiliar ground. He carries no banner, no armor, merely a book, perhaps, or a symbol carefully etched into stone. He buries it with meticulous care, not out of fear, but with an enduring hope that one day someone might discover it, comprehend it, and continue its sacred purpose. There are reports, quiet ones, of stone chambers in Vermont and Maine, bearing inscriptions no one can translate, of burial mounds disturbed and then reverently reburied with care, of Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century encountering local tribes who spoke of pale men from the East who honored the sun, but not the cross. And then there are the Rosicrucians. Their first manifestos appeared in the early 1600s, replete with allusions to hidden orders, lost temples, and knowledge preserved across the sea. Too late to be definitively Templar, too strange to be purely Protestant, yet perhaps heirs or potent echoes. The Templar trail in Europe largely fades by the mid-14th century. But in the New World, it subtly begins anew, in whispers, in enigmatic symbols, in misfit stones, hinting at a second life, a new frontier. And perhaps that was the grand design all along, to escape the suffocating control of kings and popes, to construct a temple not of stone, but of profound secrecy. You gaze once more at the tower in Rhode Island. Tourists stroll past. Children run innocently beneath its arches. No one gives it much thought. But perhaps, just perhaps, beneath those very stones lies a foundation older than the colony itself, laid not by Puritans, but by men whose order had seemingly perished in Europe, yet lived on in defiant silence. You sit beneath the high, vaulted ceiling of a Renaissance-era archive in Rome. Its cool silence is broken only by the gentle rustle of ancient parchment. Here, in this vast repository of the Vatican's secret correspondence, a peculiar envelope appears, filed not with papal bulls or council decrees, but among intercepted letters, documents never delivered, never intended to be seen. The envelope is plain, sealed in faded red wax, and marked with a unique symbol, a single diagonal slash through a circle, an old courier code meaning route altered. Inside, a letter penned in an intricate cipher, eventually broken by scholars who were initially uncertain what they were even decoding. But its contents, that is where the narrative begins to profoundly tremble. The letter is unsigned, dated 1310. Its language is deliberately veiled, as if anticipating interception, yet its meaning, once painstakingly unwrapped, is unsettlingly direct. It refers to the tribunal at Avignon, then the papal seat, and an alternative account of the Templar investigations. The writer claims a duplicate record was created, not of the public confessions, which had been brutally extracted under torture, but of earlier depositions taken before. The official trials commenced, depositions that unequivocally exonerated the order. And these crucial documents, the letter asserts, were intended to be delivered directly to the Pope himself. They never arrived. This intercepted letter strongly suggests that a high-ranking courier, possibly an agent loyal to Philip IV, deliberately diverted the documents en route from Poitiers to Avignon. Instead of being submitted to the papal archivist, they were taken to a secure chamber under royal oversight. In essence, the Pope may have based his momentous ruling on false or incomplete information. The consequences are staggering. For centuries, Clément Fafèvre has been portrayed as a reluctant conspirator, a man who acquiesced to Philip's demands, possibly under extreme duress. But what if he never saw the full testimony? What if the records we now call the Chignon parchment, discovered centuries later in the Vatican's own archive, were submitted but then systematically removed before they could reach the pontiff? If that indeed transpired, then the order's tragic fate was not merely political. It was meticulously manipulated from within the very machinery intended to judge it. The letter continues. He believes the decision his own. We believe otherwise. Who is he? The Pope? An inquisitor? Guillaume de Nogaret? Or perhaps a brave scribe within the College of Cardinals, someone who desperately attempted to raise the alarm? And who is we? It is this final question that plunges scholars down a rabbit hole. For this letter does not originate from a bishop or a royal messenger. It bears markers far more consistent with a clandestine network of couriers, some of whom possessed undeniable Templar ties. A few even bore surnames known from the order's European rolls. What if, even amidst their forced dissolution, the Templars still retained access to a shadow communication network, loyal messengers, sympathetic scribes, even rogue monks within the church who firmly believed in the order's innocence? The very existence and preservation of this letter suggests that someone on the receiving end believed its contents to be true, that someone desired it to be kept, even if unread. We observe signs of similar clandestine behavior in other areas, marginalia and papal registries where scribes note missing entry, document relocated, or even, in one chilling case, record struck but not lost. That last line has haunted historians for years. What does it truly mean to be struck but not lost? Possibly relocated, deliberately hidden, or reclassified under a new, innocuous title? One archive in Naples contains a volume labeled Matters of Moral Error, Indeterminate Allegiances. It contains pages that, at first glance, appear random. Heretical disputes, private correspondence, economic ledgers. But then you discern repeated names, Templar names, rewritten in new contexts, meticulously placed where no one would ever think to look. Returning to the Rome intercept, the final paragraph shifts in tone. It appears to address the courier directly. You have done more than interrupt a journey. You have altered the ledger of history. The rest will unfold as it must. Seal the door. Burn the wax. Burn the wax. A reference, perhaps, to destroying seals to prevent the tracing of correspondence. But what of seal the door? Is it symbolic or chillingly literal? One story persists, unconfirmed naturally, of a bricked-up chamber beneath the Dominican monastery of San Clemente. Local lore claims a secret tunnel once connected the Vatican to the monastery, used in times of extreme danger or secrecy. If such a chamber exists, and if it indeed housed diverted correspondence, it would meticulously explain the odd interruptions in certain trial records, including days that appear mysteriously skipped, and testimonies referenced but conspicuously not included. This is where the Templar mystery transcends mere relics and becomes fundamentally about records. For what is history, if not the rigorous control of memory? And who controls memory, if not those who decide what is read and what is irrevocably sealed away? You envision that courier, dusty from his journey, pausing outside the gates of Avignon with the Pope's letter in hand. He hesitates, rewrote, and leaves no discernible trace, save for this single copy, this intercepted echo of a different outcome that tragically never materialized. Was he acting under explicit orders? Was he paid? Or did he truly believe in the righteousness of his clandestine actions? We may never know. But one truth is clear. The trial of the Templars was not merely a matter of faith or politics. It was a masterclass in manipulation, of truth, yes, but more devastatingly, of access to truth. The Rome intercept is not irrefutable proof of innocence. It is irrefutable proof of profound interference. And that, you realize, is almost more damning, because interference invariably creates shadows, and shadows breed silence. There is an ancient superstition among Vatican scribes, beware the final page. It is where crucial truths are meticulously tucked away, safe from the casual eyes of readers who cease their inquiry too soon. The addendum, often overlooked, frequently misfiled, is where the profound weight of real history sometimes chooses to hide. And in one particularly peculiar case, that final page may irrevocably alter everything. In the year 2001, during a routine, quiet audit of archived ecclesiastical decrees in the Vatican Secret Archive, now formally known as the Apostolic Archive, a meticulous preservation assistant discovered something truly unusual. The document in question was filed under a general heading, Conclusio Templariorum, a collection of 14th century administrative notes related to the official disbanding of the Knights Templar. It was a well-trodden folder, handled by countless scholars. Nothing extraordinary until the assistant noticed the stitching. A second, thinner page had been delicately sewn to the back of the final leaf, almost imperceptibly. It bore no title, no signature, merely a series of lines in an unfamiliar hand, smoother, more personal, written in Latin, yet subtly drifting into poetic metaphor. The team initially dismissed it as a mere clerical note, a scribe's meditation, but closer examination suggested otherwise. The handwriting bore striking similarities to that of Pope Clement V himself. And the contents? They were not administrative. They were deeply reflective, profoundly conflicted, almost remorseful. The addendum commences, "What is absolved in spirit cannot be condemned in blood," a sentence that appears in no other known papal decree. It continues with phrases that unequivocally hint at private regret and a profound awareness of duplicity. "I was shown one road and I walked another. I heard both sides but spoke only one." No direct mention of Philip IV, no explicit reference to the Chinon parchment, but the tone speaks volumes. It reads like a deathbed confession. Clement died in 1314. The document is dated early that same year. And then comes the strangest passage. "If ever these words are read, let them serve not to absolve me, but to alert the reader. History will believe what is repeated. I say now they were not heretics. They were only inconvenient." That word, inconvenient, is startling. Not criminal, not doctrinally dangerous, merely a problem, a threat to established power, a wrinkle in the seemingly seamless robe of papal and royal authority. And here, the tone shifts again. "Their knowledge I did not understand. Their silence frightened me more than their speech. What they preserved, beyond coin, beyond rite, I feared it would unravel too much." It is difficult not to recall the Concords, mentioned in earlier chapters, the suggestion that the Templars guarded not merely gold or relics, but profound ideas, unique ways of thinking, perhaps even records from the East that fundamentally challenged the Western view of divine order. Clement's final words on the page resonate profoundly. "I left the window open. I pray that the wind finds it." Sure. There is no explicit context for this line, no direct explanation, but it feels deliberate, as if he knew the message would lie dormant, unnoticed, until someone with the right perspective eventually unearthed it. When the document was presented to Vatican archivists, the response was, understandably, cautious. They acknowledged its authenticity, but refused to reclassify the Templar case based on a personal note of ambiguous origin. Fair enough. No signature, no official seal. But the timing, the distinctive handwriting, the compelling content, together, they raise a powerful and compelling possibility that Clement V did not fully support the brutal execution of the Templars, that he may have been maneuvered, manipulated, or, more chillingly, simply overwhelmed by the immense forces aligned against them. It irrevocably reframes the entire arc of the Templar trials. Imagine a papacy tragically caught between the ruthless absolutism of a French king and the silent, insidious pressure of ancient knowledge resurfacing in his very court. Clement was not merely attempting to manage a scandal. He was desperately trying to contain something far more volatile, profound uncertainty, not about the Templars' faith, but about the very foundations of his own. The implications ripple outward. If the Pope himself believed they were innocent, or at least not guilty of heresy, then the Church's official narrative becomes not merely flawed, but profoundly suspect. And if knowledge of that fundamental doubt was rigorously suppressed, deliberately hidden in the forgotten folds of bureaucracy, then what else might have been buried? Perhaps this is why so many crucial pieces were scattered. Why the Concords were clandestinely smuggled. Why Hugo's cipher was hidden in salt. Why Bertrandon buried his diary beneath a false wall. Why the Rome Intercept warned of the redirected record. They were not merely preserving information. They were preparing for a future reader. Someone who might one day find enough fragments to begin connecting the broken circle. You gaze again at the addendum. The handwriting is delicate. The ink has faded to a soft brown. The paper is fragile with age. But the message has waited patiently, not for exoneration, but for understanding. And perhaps that is what history ultimately represents. Not a rigid ledger of facts, but a slow, secret conversation spanning centuries. One voice hiding beneath another. One truth meticulously stitched into the margins of lies, waiting for someone to open the final page. From the faint ashes in the archives to the haunting whispers from Chinon. From Malta's darkened vaults to the ciphered scroll of Hugo de Aragon, every fragmented piece points toward a coordinated, meticulous effort, not necessarily by the Templars themselves, but by those who believe them profoundly worth remembering. There is a crucial difference. Not every piece fits neatly into place. Some resist categorization, others present seeming contradictions. But this, you realize, is not evidence of fiction. It is the undeniable hallmark of real historical trauma. Suppressed records do not vanish cleanly. They splinter. They echo. They mutate into myth, precisely because no other narrative is permitted to exist. The Chinon parchment, once buried within the Vatican for centuries, irrevocably revealed that Clement V had personally absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. Yet the executions tragically proceeded. Why? Because absolution on parchment is meaningless if it never reaches the public sphere. The Rome Intercept powerfully implies that it did not, that the Pope based his monumental ruling on partial, manipulated testimony. And if that proves true, then the entire trial collapses under the immense weight of its own procedural failure. The forgotten addendum suggests guilt, but not heresy. A quiet, posthumous confession, perhaps, that something precious was allowed to slip into fire and ash, not because it was false, but because it was politically inconvenient. Then there is Malta, a hexagonal chamber, niches for missing objects, a sealed wall behind which something patiently awaits. A pattern repeated in Hugo's scroll, in Bertrandon's diary, in architectural anomalies, and in rites echoing from Syria to Scotland. These are not the whimsical embellishments of conspiracy. They are the undeniable residue of meticulous preservation. A courier reroutes a message. A scribe marks a scroll with a symbol no one truly understands. A knight crosses the vast sea and constructs nothing more than a tower, small, strange, and almost eerily quiet. At every stage, the same profound instinct prevails: preserve in silence what cannot be spoken aloud. And always, that central, enduring enigma, the Concords. No one knows their true nature, but their echoes persist. In the phrase, that which bends light but holds none. In the bowl carved from 7 layers. In the chilling line from the scroll, the ink is hidden in salt. The voice is hidden in dust. This was not gold, not land, not even doctrine. It was something that passed hand to hand, mind to mind, too volatile for parchment, too sacred for decree. Perhaps it was not a single object, but a profound tradition, a method of seeing, of decoding the world, something the Church deeply feared, something the crown could not tax, something that demanded silence to survive. And so, the Templars died, not for what they did, but for what they knew. And others in their wake meticulously ensured that knowledge did not perish with them. You now return to the letter, the one that initiated this entire profound journey, the impossible letter, the one the Vatican never officially acknowledged, the one that asserted the Templars were exonerated long before they were so brutally condemned. You read it again, and in doing so, you discern something subtle, yet profound. Not in the ink, but in the very folds, pressed lightly into the crease, a faint indentation, the unmistakable shape of a seal, long broken. Not a papal crest, not a royal emblem, but something far simpler, a circle crossed through the center. The courier's mark for route altered. So, perhaps the story was rerouted, deliberately diverted, purposefully lost, but not lost forever. Here, in this archive of fragments, in the dust between the lines, the shapes begin to re-emerge, the seal broken too late, the diary without its final page, the poignant silence of the Pope, and Clement's final haunting whisper. They were not heretics. They were only inconvenient. What remains now is not a definitive conclusion, but a profound continuity. Because what the Templars may have carried Whatever it truly was never truly buried, only scattered, only patiently waiting. You sit with the pieces now. Not a full picture, no, but enough. Enough to perceive the outline of something long obscured, a persistent pattern, an underlying pressure, a quiet thread weaving through time, written not in ink, but in omission, in margins, in profound silence. You have walked with ghosts, not the spectral kind, but those forged from parchment, wax, and fading memory, a burned scroll, a sealed chamber, a broken seal, a forgotten addendum. And the question that relentlessly lingers is not what the Templars truly were, but what they were meticulously hiding. The answer remains elusive, not because it does not exist, but because it was never intended to be read plainly. You sense it in the concords. You glimpse it in the rituals that echoed older traditions. You hear it in the ciphers and prayers that were not quite Christian. Not entirely. It may not have been a treasure in the conventional sense, not gold, not relics, not power. Rather, it was something dangerous to certainty, a unique way of knowing, a profound way of remembering, a fierce refusal to forget that truth can be kept alive not by empire, not by decree, but by the quiet persistence of those who will not relinquish it. So much was lost, but not everything. Not if someone keenly notices the missing page, the cracked seal, the whisper in the margins. You ponder who else has looked, who else has followed this same labyrinthine trail of fragments, and paused, just as you do now, at the precipice of understanding. And you realize, perhaps, that this is precisely what the Templars bequeathed to us, not just secrets, but a vital task: to look closer, to question relentlessly, to listen when history falls silent, and to ask what it is desperately trying not to say.